Imagine waking before sunrise in a stone palace that everyone insists is the most splendid place in the kingdom. The walls are hung with tapestries thick enough to soften the draughts but not stop them. The floor is strewn with rushes or covered by boards that hold the night's cold. Somewhere beyond the bed curtains, servants move quietly with candles. A fire has burned low. The air smells of smoke, wax, damp wool, perfume, old stone, and the faint human odours that no amount of incense can completely erase. You are a queen, and almost nothing in this room is truly yours. Not your time, not your body, not your marriage, not even the silence before you open your eyes. That was the contradiction at the centre of medieval queenship. A queen could possess jewels that would ransom a nobleman, sleep beneath embroidered silk, command hundreds of servants, and ride beneath banners while crowds knelt in the mud. Yet she could also live under a pressure so constant that modern ideas of privacy, rest, and personal choice barely applied. Her marriage might decide the fate of provinces. Her fertility might determine whether a dynasty survived. Her manners could become a political weapon. Her friendships might be interpreted as factions. Her letters could be intercepted. Her servants could spy. A cough could become a court rumour. A miscarriage could become a national crisis. The phrase medieval queen covers centuries and very different worlds: the courts of England and France, the kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula, the Holy Roman Empire, Scandinavia, Hungary, Sicily, and many others. There was no single routine shared by every crowned woman from the 11th to the 15th century. Some queens were powerful landholders, some ruled as regents, some led armies or negotiated treaties, some were kept deliberately away from power. Some lived into old age, others died in childbirth before reaching 30. But the architecture of their lives was often built around the same demands: dynastic marriage, public ceremony, religious expectation, household management, pregnancy, travel, patronage, and the endless need to appear composed under scrutiny. For many queens, misery began not with a dramatic betrayal, but with a departure. A princess could be raised among familiar voices, familiar food, a familiar language, and women she had known since infancy, only to be sent across mountains or seas to marry a man she had barely met. Marriage was diplomacy made flesh. A daughter of one dynasty became the guarantee of a treaty signed by men. She might be 13, 15, 17. Her baggage could contain gowns, devotional books, jewels, linen, silver plate, and carefully chosen attendants from home. Yet the most important thing she carried was her bloodline. Consider Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most famous queens of the Middle Ages. She inherited the vast Duchy of Aquitaine, married Louis VII of France, went on the Second Crusade, obtained an annulment, and then married Henry Plantagenet, who became Henry II of England. Her life was extraordinary, but even her exceptional power did not free her from dynastic expectation. Her marriages were political arrangements of the highest order. Her lands made her valuable, her sons made her dangerous, and her later support for her son's rebellion against Henry II helped lead to years of confinement. The woman who had crossed kingdoms and influenced empires spent a long part of her mature life under the watch of the husband she had defied. Now imagine a less famous princess making a similar journey without Eleanor's wealth or force of character. The road itself could be brutal. Medieval courts were mobile. Royal families did not remain permanently in one palace, but moved among castles, hunting lodges, religious houses, estates, and cities. A queen might travel for days over roads that became mud after rain, through forests where wheel ruts swallowed carts, across rivers where bridges were unreliable, and into crowded towns whose bells announced her arrival before she had any chance to recover from the journey. A litter offered status but not comfort. A horse offered speed, but hours in the saddle could leave the body aching. Winter travel meant numb fingers and wet cloaks. Summer travel meant dust, flies, sweat, and the smell of horses. Every arrival triggered performance. Town officials came out to greet the royal party. Clergy processed with relics. Bells rang. Streets might be decorated. Gifts were presented. Speeches were delivered. A queen who had slept badly, eaten little, and spent 6 hours on the road still had to smile, dismount, accept formal welcomes, kneel for prayers, and show the correct measure of dignity. She could not simply say she was exhausted and disappear upstairs. Her body was part of the ceremony. Her household moved with her like a small government. Chamberwomen, ladies-in-waiting, clerks, chaplains, confessors, cooks, laundresses, grooms, messengers, guards, physicians, apothecaries, almoners, and accountants all depended on the court's rhythm. The Queen's chamber was not merely a bedroom. It was a controlled political space. Access mattered. Who could enter? Who could speak with her privately? Who dressed her? Who carried messages? Who slept nearby? In an age before electronic surveillance, proximity itself was power. Morning began early, though the exact routine varied by period and personality. Servants might enter while it was still dark. They tended the fire, brought water, opened shutters when weather allowed, folded bedding, and prepared garments. If the Queen had attended late entertainment the previous night, she was not guaranteed a leisurely morning. Religious obligations structured the day. Matins and lauds belonged technically to the night and early morning in monastic schedules, but lay aristocratic devotion could take different forms. Queens heard Mass regularly, kept private prayer books, supported chapels, honoured saints' days, and maintained relationships with confessors whose spiritual advice could also carry political weight. Washing did not mean the modern ritual of a hot shower behind a locked door. Medieval elite hygiene was more complex than the stereotype of universal filth suggests. People washed hands and faces, combed hair, changed linen, used scented waters, and sometimes bathed in tubs. Wealth made water, fuel, soap, towels, and attendants easier to obtain. But a full bath required preparation. Water had to be carried and heated. The room had to be warmed. Screens or cloths might provide modesty, yet attendants were still nearby. Even bodily cleanliness could involve supervision. The Queen's clothing was labour. A noblewoman's garments were layered and fastened in ways that required assistance. Linen undergarments, kirtles, gowns, belts, sleeves, mantles, veils, caps and jewellery could all signal wealth, rank, marital status, regional fashion, or solemnity. Fabrics themselves were political statements. Silk travelled across long-distance trade networks. Fine wool linked royal consumption to the economies of England and Flanders. Fur announced status and helped fight the cold. Gold embroidery transformed a moving human body into a display of dynastic power. And that display had to be correct. Clothing laws in medieval societies sometimes tried to regulate who could wear certain materials or colours. Courts developed their own expectations. A queen dressed too plainly might insult an occasion or suggest poverty. A queen dressed too extravagantly could be attacked for vanity or foreign influence. Chroniclers were quick to notice excess, especially in women. The safest path was narrow, magnificent but not frivolous, modest but not unimpressive, fashionable but not suspiciously foreign, fertile-looking but chaste, visible but controlled. Her hair alone could require time. Long hair carried symbolic force, especially in ceremonial contexts, while married women often covered or arranged it according to custom. Combs of wood, bone, ivory, or precious material drew through hair that had to be cleaned, scented, braided, pinned, and veiled. Lice existed across social classes, although elite households had more resources to manage them. Fine-toothed combs were practical objects, not just ornaments. The Queen's head, so often crowned in public imagery, depended each morning on hands that knew exactly how to make royal dignity appear effortless. Breakfast, if taken, was not necessarily a large formal meal. Medieval meal timing differed from modern habits, and the first substantial meal of the day might be later in the morning. The Queen's diet depended on season, region, religious rules, medical advice, and access to supplies. Bread was central. Meat could be abundant at elite tables, but fasting days transformed menus. Fish, eggs, dairy where permitted, legumes, fruits, nuts, spices, wine, and ale appeared in different combinations. Spices such as pepper, cinnamon, cloves, ginger, saffron, and nutmeg were costly and prestigious. They did not exist mainly to hide rotten meat, a common modern myth. Elite households had strong incentives to serve food that was fresh by the standards of the time, and spoiled meat was no more desirable then than now. Yet abundance did not guarantee freedom. If a physician believed certain foods produced unhealthy humours, the queen could be advised or pressured to avoid them. Medieval learned medicine drew heavily on classical and Arabic medical traditions, especially humoral theory. Health depended in this framework on balancing hot, cold, wet, and dry qualities. Food, sleep, exercise, baths, emotions, and even the season could be interpreted through this system. A queen who complained of headaches, infertility, weakness, or digestive trouble might be prescribed dietary changes, herbs, syrups, purges, bloodletting, rest, or devotional remedies. The most personal medical concern was fertility. A queen's reproductive life was not merely personal, it belonged to the dynasty. From the moment a marriage was consummated, courtiers watched for pregnancy. A missed period could become political intelligence. A swelling abdomen could affect diplomacy. If the queen conceived, prayers of thanksgiving might be offered. If she failed to conceive, anxiety spread beyond her chamber. The absence of an heir could encourage rival claimants, intensify pressure on the king, and expose the queen to blame, even though medieval people did not understand reproduction in modern biological terms. Pregnancy transformed the queen's daily routine into a public waiting room. Food might be adjusted, travel could be reduced, though not always. Religious intercession intensified. Saints associated with childbirth were invoked. Relics might be brought near. Protective objects, girdles, prayers, and charms circulated within a Christian culture that officially condemned superstition, yet lived beside a world of practical ritual. The queen's attendants watched her body for signs. Her physicians watched her complexion, pulse, appetite, urine, and mood. Her family waited for news. Foreign ambassadors sometimes reported reproductive developments with astonishing directness because succession mattered internationally. The stakes were cruelly high. Childbirth was dangerous for all women, and royal status could not eliminate hemorrhage, infection, obstructed labour, eclampsia, or complications no medieval physician could reliably treat. A queen had access to experienced midwives and attendants, but knowledge had limits. Childbed fever could kill after the delivery appeared successful. A retained placenta could become fatal. A baby in the wrong position could mean hours or days of agony. In the later Middle Ages, elite childbirth in parts of Europe involved a period of confinement. The birthing chamber might be darkened, warm, enclosed with tapestries, and populated largely by women. Male physicians could be nearby or consulted under particular circumstances, but childbirth was primarily a female space. To modernize, the room could seem suffocating. Shutters closed, fires burning, heavy fabrics trapping heat and scent, prayers repeated, women moving around the labouring queen while the kingdom waited outside. If a child survived, the first question was often sex. A daughter could be celebrated, particularly if she served future diplomatic purposes. But a son meant something else. Continuity, military expectation, inheritance, and relief. Bells might ring, messengers rode out, gifts were distributed. The queen, meanwhile, could be bleeding, feverish, exhausted, and barely conscious. Her most physically dangerous achievement might instantly become a public festival happening beyond the walls, and then she was expected to do it again. Some queens experienced pregnancy after pregnancy. Medieval royal genealogies can look like lists of births, but behind each date was months of physical strain. Philippa of Hainault, Queen of Edward III of England, bore many children over a long marriage. Eleanor of Castile, wife of Edward I, also endured numerous pregnancies, with many children dying young. Numbers vary according to records and definitions, but what matters is the relentless cycle: conception, pregnancy, birth, recovery, nursing arrangements, infant illness, mourning, and renewed pressure for another child. Infant mortality made motherhood precarious even in palaces. Rich bedding, wet nurses, servants, and physicians could not stop infections that modern antibiotics or vaccines would later control. A royal nursery could contain the best material resources in the kingdom and still lose a child to fever, respiratory disease, gastrointestinal illness, accident, or epidemic. The Queen might not personally nurse every infant. Wet nursing was common among elites, yet emotional bonds were not absent simply because childcare structures differed from modern middle-class expectations. Royal mothers grieved. Letters and chronicles sometimes preserve intense concern for sick children. Dynastic politics did not erase private pain, it amplified it. The child's survival also changed the Queen's political value. As mother of the heir, she might gain influence. Her household could become a centre of patronage. Petitioners might approach her because she had access to the king and emotional influence over their son. But motherhood could also trap her more tightly. If political conflict later emerged between king and heir, the Queen might be forced into impossible loyalties. Eleanor of Aquitaine's relationship with Henry II and their sons is a dramatic example. Margaret of Anjou, wife of Henry VI, became fiercely associated with the Lancastrian cause during the Wars of the Roses because her husband's incapacity and her son's inheritance left her with little room for political passivity. A Queen's Day, then, could shift from prayer to petitions, from embroidery to diplomacy, from childcare to ritual, from illness to public feasting. Her apparent leisure was not necessarily empty time. Elite women managed properties, maintained correspondence, distributed charity, arranged marriages within their affinity, intervened for petitioners, and supervised complex households. The Queen's wardrobe department alone could handle vast quantities of cloth, fur, jewellery, repairs, gifts, and ceremonial equipment. Accounts had to be kept, debts had to be settled, servants needed wages, horses had to be fed, travel required planning, arms had to be distributed in ways that reflected Christian kingship and queenship. Charity was expected because a queen was not simply a wealthy woman, she was supposed to embody mercy. Medieval political culture idealized kings as dispensers of justice and queens as intercessors. This did not mean queens were powerless ornaments. Intercession itself could be politically significant. A queen might beg for a prisoner's pardon, support a monastery, give food to the poor, fund masses for the dead, endow hospitals, or sponsor religious houses. Such acts were spiritual, social, and political at once. The ritual could be emotionally strange. Imagine walking into a great hall where impoverished petitioners have waited for hours. They kneel. Some are visibly sick. Some carry children. Some present written pleas prepared by clerks because they cannot write. You hand out coins or authorize relief. Everyone watches your face. Compassion is expected, but so is majesty. Too much familiarity risks lowering the dignity of the crown. Too little makes you appear cold. Even mercy has choreography. Queens could become famous for piety. Blanche of Castile, mother of Louis IX of France, combined intense religious identity with formidable political authority. She acted as regent and defended her son's interests against powerful nobles. Her example reveals another medieval contradiction. The same culture that praised feminine obedience could accept, and at times depend upon, a queen mother exercising real power when dynastic stability required it. Yet a woman who ruled too forcefully could be accused of domination, ambition, or unnatural behaviour. That accusation hovered over many royal women. When politics went well, the Queen might be celebrated as wise, fertile, charitable, and peacemaking. When things went badly, foreign birth, female influence, luxury, sexuality, and family connections could become weapons against her. Isabella of France, Queen of Edward II of England, entered history with one of the most notorious posthumous reputations. Her marriage collapsed amid the king's political disasters and favourites. She went to France, allied with Roger Mortimer, returned with an invasion force in 1326, and helped overthrow Edward. Later writers exaggerated elements of her image into the lurid she-wolf of France. Behind the legend was a queen navigating a marriage that had become entangled with civil war, confiscated property, rival factions, and the brutal mechanics of regime change. The Queen's foreignness was often impossible to escape. She might arrive with a different accent, different food preferences, different fashions, and relatives who expected advancement. Her household could contain compatriots who made her feel less isolated, but provoked resentment among local nobles. If she patronised foreigners, she might be accused of draining the realm. If she dismissed them, she lost the people she trusted most. Language itself could make marriage lonely. Elite Europeans were often multilingual or educated in courtly languages, Latin for formal documents and regional vernaculars, but fluency was not guaranteed. A young princess could enter a court where jokes, insults, prayers, gossip and political nuances moved faster than her ability to understand them. She learned by listening while being judged for every mistake, and gossip moved fast. Medieval courts were information machines. Servants overheard arguments, chaplains heard confessions, but also lived in political networks. Ladies carried messages, ambassadors cultivated contacts. Household officers knew who visited whom after dark. The Queen's chamber, despite its curtains and screens, was porous. A raised voice behind a door could be discussed by dinner. A private quarrel with the king could become a diplomatic rumour by the end of the week. This mattered because sexual reputation was political capital. Queens were held to intense standards of chastity. A king might have mistresses with limited damage to his legitimacy. A queen accused of adultery threatened the bloodline itself. If the mother of an heir was unfaithful, enemies could question whether the heir was truly royal. That made allegations of sexual misconduct among the most dangerous charges a queen could face. The case of Anne Boleyn belongs to the 16th century, and therefore to the Tudor period rather than the medieval world in the strictest sense. But the logic behind her downfall had deep medieval roots. Female sexuality, succession, factional politics, and treason could be fused into a lethal accusation. Earlier queens also lived under the knowledge that sexual rumour could destroy trust and alter dynastic politics. The fear did not require actual adultery. Reputation alone could wound. For this reason, a queen was rarely alone with a man who was not her husband, close family, confessor, or trusted official under accepted conditions. Ladies and servants created a protective social barrier. Privacy, from a modern perspective, was nearly absent. But the lack of privacy was not merely oppressive, it also defended reputation. Witnesses could prove that nothing improper occurred. The Queen's entourage was both cage and shield. Meals offered another daily performance. A royal dinner could take place in a hall crowded with household officers, nobles, visiting envoys, clerics, musicians and servants. Seating expressed hierarchy. Tableware expressed wealth. The order in which dishes appeared, who carved, who served, who washed the royal hands, and who stood nearby, all reflected rank. A queen might eat in greater privacy on some occasions, but public dining turned the human act of hunger into a demonstration of government. Hands were washed before and after eating. Napkins and tablecloths mattered. Knives were personal tools more often than modern table settings. Forks existed in parts of Europe, but were not yet universal in the Western courts for much of the medieval period. Food could be served in trenchers made of bread, or on metal plates depending on period and status. Shared dishes were common, but etiquette regulated how one reached, cut, dipped, and drank. Courtly manners were not primitive chaos, they were highly coded. The Queen had to understand those codes perfectly, because small actions could be magnified. Who received a smile? Which ambassador was placed near her? Which noblewoman sat closest? Whose gift did she admire? Did she speak to a controversial bishop? Did she mention a distant relative's claim? Dining could become diplomacy disguised as appetite. Then there was fasting. The medieval Christian calendar contained numerous fast days and abstinence rules, although observance varied by time, place, health, and status. On certain days, meat was prohibited, fish became central. Royal cooks developed elaborate alternatives because piety did not require culinary boredom. Eels, pike, salmon, herring, shellfish, and other foods could appear. Almond milk was useful in fasting cuisine because dairy restrictions could be complicated. Spiced sauces, pastries, fruits, and sweetened dishes transformed restraint into spectacle. But fasting during pregnancy, illness, or weakness created tensions between devotion and medical advice. Dispensations could be obtained. A confessor might permit exceptions. A physician might insist on meat. The Queen's plate became another battlefield between body, church, and expectation. Afternoons could involve counsel, correspondence, needlework, reading, music, hunting, falconry, walking in gardens, visits to religious institutions, or receiving petitioners. The popular image of noblewomen endlessly embroidering can sound trivial until one understands that textiles were both art and social labour. Women worked together while talking. Patterns conveyed identity. Gifts of embroidered cloth strengthened relationships. Devotional textiles served churches. A queen's workshop could involve skilled professional artisans alongside ladies of rank. Books offered another form of power and escape. Literate queens commissioned manuscripts, owned psalters and books of hours, supported poets, and sometimes shaped literary culture. A private devotional book could be one of the most intimate objects in the Queen's possession. Its pages held saints, calendars, prayers, miniatures, and sometimes family notes. Fingers touched the same vellum through pregnancy, grief, travel, and political crisis. When almost every public action was observed, a prayer whispered over a book could feel like a private room. Yet even religion came with obligation. Royal piety was visible. Queens founded monasteries, paid for masses, honoured relics, and participated in processions because salvation mattered personally and because sacred legitimacy mattered politically. A queen seen as insufficiently devout risked criticism. A queen seen as excessively influenced by a confessor could also be criticised. The ideal, again, was a balance almost impossible to sustain. The palace around her was not a silent museum. It was alive with work. Kitchens roared, spits turned, bakers mixed dough, butchers cut meat, scullions scrubbed pots, brewers managed ale, grooms shovelled manure, smiths repaired metal, carpenters fixed furniture, tailors stitched, laundresses dealt with linens stained by sweat, food, blood, and childbirth. Messengers ran with sealed letters, dogs moved under benches, children of servants played in corners, bells marked worship, clerks scratched accounts onto parchment, guards challenged arrivals at gates. The Queen lived at the centre of a human machine that could never fully stop. And machines produce noise, waste, and exhaustion. Royal residences could smell. Latrines, chamber pots, kitchens, stables, tallow candles, smoke, damp straw, bodies, dogs, and refuse all contributed. Some castles had garderobes built into walls, so waste dropped into pits or down shafts. Chamber pots were emptied by servants. Cleanliness depended on labour, and the Queen's comfort rested on someone else carrying away what polite art never showed. The toilet was another moment without true privacy. A high-status, close stool or chamber pot might be screened, upholstered, or placed in a private chamber, but servants were nearby because clothing, water, linen, and disposal required assistance. Constipation, diarrhea, menstruation, pregnancy, and postpartum bleeding were not abstract medical terms. They happened inside heavy gowns, in cold rooms, on roads, during ceremonies, and in buildings where plumbing as we know it did not exist. Menstruation itself was surrounded by medical and religious interpretations that varied across time and region. Medieval women managed bleeding with cloth, absorbent materials, layered garments, and practical knowledge passed between women. A queen had better linen than a peasant woman, but her cycle could be politically scrutinised because it related to fertility. Something intensely private could become the subject of court calculation. Even sleep was compromised. Royal bedchambers could be crowded by modern standards. Attendants might sleep in adjacent rooms, or even within the chamber, depending on household organisation. Guards remained nearby. A queen's bed was a symbol of status, a site of marriage, childbirth, illness, and sometimes political theatre. Rich curtains provided warmth and a degree of enclosure, but not the psychological privacy of a modern locked bedroom. The bed itself required maintenance. Feather mattresses and layered bedding could be comfortable, especially for elites, but vermin were a recurring problem in pre-modern environments. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs did not respect nobility. Bedding was aired, cleaned, beaten, and replaced when possible. Herbs and scents were used. Royal wealth reduced exposure but did not create a sealed, hygienic world. At night, the palace changed character. Candles were expensive. Firelight moved against stone walls. Corridors became darker. Servants carried torches or lanterns. Security increased because the ruler's household was vulnerable to theft, espionage, and violence. The queen might pray before sleeping. She might talk quietly with a trusted lady. She might receive the king. She might lie awake while wind pushed against shutters, wondering whether she was pregnant, whether a child's fever would break, whether a letter from home had arrived, whether a noble faction was turning against her. For a queen married to a powerful and temperamental man, the bedroom could also be a place of fear. Medieval marital ideals emphasized hierarchy, with husbands generally understood as heads of households, although law and practice varied. Queens possessed rank no ordinary wife could match, but rank did not guarantee emotional safety. Royal marriages could be affectionate, distant, strategic, hostile, or all of these at different times. Some couples appear to have shared real attachment. Edward I was devastated by Eleanor of Castile's death in 1290, and erected the famous Eleanor crosses along the route of her funeral procession from Lincoln to Westminster. The monuments speak to royal memory and public commemoration, though they should not be reduced to proof of a perfect marriage. Even loving royal relationships existed within political structures that gave husbands enormous power. Other marriages became catastrophes. Isabella of France's conflict with Edward II deepened as the king favoured Hugh Despenser the Younger and his allies. Isabella's lands and access were restricted. She eventually refused to return from France until Despenser was removed, allied with Mortimer, and invaded England. The story is not simply one of a wicked queen overthrowing her husband, or a heroic woman escaping oppression. It is a civil conflict in which marriage, property, personal grievance, baronial resentment, and dynastic politics fused together. But from the perspective of daily life, it reveals a terrifying fact. A queen could eat from gold plate and still have no safe domestic exit from a collapsing marriage, except politics at the level of invasion. Margaret of Anjou faced a different nightmare. Married to Henry VI of England in 1445, she entered a kingdom increasingly divided by factional conflict. Henry's episodes of mental incapacity destabilised royal government. Their son, Edward of Westminster, became the centre of dynastic hope and fear. Margaret's political involvement grew because passivity could mean the destruction of her husband's dynasty. Later Yorkist propaganda portrayed her as unnaturally aggressive, yet the political system itself had created the conditions in which a queen was expected to defend her child's inheritance and then condemned for doing so. War destroyed any illusion that royal women lived protected from physical danger. A queen might flee from one fortress to another as armies moved. Roads filled with troops, supplies became uncertain, messengers arrived with contradictory news. A battle lost 30 miles away could erase a decade of security by nightfall. Royal jewellery might become collateral for loans. Household plate could be melted or pledged. Children could be separated for safety. A queen's ladies might find themselves sleeping in improvised quarters with no certainty about who controlled the road ahead. Sieges were especially brutal. Castles could be magnificent residences in peacetime and traps in war. Food stocks mattered, wells mattered, disease mattered. If attackers surrounded the walls, even a queen's status could not produce fresh meat or safe passage. Stone towers became prisons measured not by chains, but by dwindling grain. The queen was also expected to understand politics without appearing to crave it. That was one of the most exhausting contradictions of her office. She needed enough knowledge to advise, intercede, protect her household, secure her children's futures, manage estates, and respond to crises. Yet a woman who seemed to dominate counsel could provoke backlash. Influence worked best when disguised as loyalty, mercy, maternal concern, or private counsel. Letters became crucial. Queens corresponded with relatives, bishops, nobles, city governments, popes, and other rulers. Some letters were personally dictated, others shaped by secretaries according to formal conventions. Seals authenticated authority. Messengers could take days or weeks. Bad weather delayed news. A queen might make a decision based on information already obsolete by the time it reached her. That slowness produced its own kind of anxiety. Imagine knowing your daughter is travelling across the Alps but receiving no word for 6 weeks. Imagine hearing that your brother is ill in another kingdom but not knowing whether he is alive when you answer. Imagine learning of a rebellion after the rebels have already occupied a town. The medieval world was connected, but it was connected at the speed of horse, sail, and human endurance. Royal women often maintained ties to their birth families long after marriage. Those ties could comfort them, but also make them suspect. A queen's brother might ask for money. Her father might expect diplomatic support. Her homeland might go to war with her husband's kingdom. Then blood and marriage pulled in opposite directions. Berengaria of Navarre, wife of Richard I of England, illustrates another form of royal loneliness. She married a king who spent little of his reign in England and much of his time on crusade, in captivity, or at war in his French territories. Berengaria herself almost certainly never visited England during Richard's lifetime. Her title was grand, her marriage was politically significant, her daily reality was shaped by separation. Queenship could mean standing beside the most famous man in Christendom and still living mostly apart from him. The absence of a husband could increase responsibility. A queen might act as regent, protect royal interests, manage revenues, or negotiate with nobles. But power brought danger. Blanche of Castile governed France during the minority of her son Louis IX, and again held influence during his absence on crusade. Her position required decisiveness in a world where great lords possessed private armies, fortified castles, and ambitions of their own. She had to be pious enough to embody royal motherhood and ruthless enough to keep a kingdom together. For the Queen, family life was therefore never separate from government. A child's marriage was foreign policy, a daughter's dowry affected finances, a son's household could become a political faction, a cousin's visit might signal alliance. Even christenings, funerals, and weddings redistributed access to power. Weddings could be physically exhausting. Royal marriage ceremonies involved processions, mass, feasting, music, formal bedding rituals in some cultures, gift exchange, and days of entertainment. The bride might arrive after a punishing journey and immediately become the centre of scrutiny. Was she beautiful? Was she healthy? Did she seem fertile? Did she speak gracefully? Did she look pleased? Chroniclers might comment on all of it. Beauty was political but unstable. Medieval beauty ideals differed across time and place, yet pale skin, fine features, certain hair colours, and a graceful body were often praised in aristocratic literature. Portrait likeness, as we understand it, developed unevenly. A princess could be described by envoys before marriage, and later centuries would make portrait exchange more important. Physical appearance could affect negotiations, because marriage combined diplomacy with the expectation of sex and heirs. If the king disliked his bride, her position could become precarious. Annulment was difficult, but possible under canon law for specific impediments such as prohibited degrees of kinship, prior contracts, non-consummation, or other legal grounds. Political actors could manipulate these rules. A queen knew that the theology of indissoluble marriage offered protection, but not absolute protection. Widowhood changed everything. A queen dowager might finally gain a degree of personal autonomy, especially if she possessed dower lands and adult children. Or widowhood could strip away protection and leave her fighting for income. Dower arrangements were supposed to support widowed queens, but enforcement could become political. Lands promised in marriage contracts might be disputed. Officials might delay payments. A former queen could spend years pursuing revenues that existed beautifully on parchment, but poorly in practice. Some widows remarried, and that could cause scandal. A queen's second marriage raised questions because her body and property remained politically valuable. Catherine de Valois, widow of Henry V of England, formed a relationship with Owen Tudor. Their descendants would eventually create the Tudor dynasty. Her personal choice, whether formal marriage or private union, became a political origin story no diplomat could have predicted. Others withdrew into religious patronage or more secluded courts. A widow could cultivate an image of pious mourning. Black clothing, foundations, masses, and memorials served devotion but also preserved dynastic memory. The dead king remained politically useful, and the queen's grief could become public ritual. Death was always nearby. Royal households lost children, servants, friends, clerics, and relatives regularly. Epidemics ignored rank. The Black Death of the 14th century transformed Europe with mortality on a scale that overwhelmed social structures. Queens were not insulated from plague. Joanna of England, daughter of Edward III, died of the Black Death in 1348 while travelling toward Castile for marriage. She was not a queen yet, but her death reveals how a dynastic plan involving ships, treasure, servants, treaties, and royal blood could be erased by disease before a wedding occurred. The plague also changed the world queens governed. Labour shortages altered economic relationships. Urban unrest and rural demands challenged elites. Religious fear intensified. Courts moved to avoid outbreaks when possible. Reports of sickness could empty a residence quickly. The Queen's household packed trunks, plate, linens, medicines and documents, then moved again. Another road, another temporary chamber, another night listening for news of who had died behind them. Medicine offered little certainty. Royal physicians were educated, prestigious, and sometimes highly sophisticated within the intellectual frameworks of their age. They consulted texts, observed symptoms, examined urine, prescribed diets and medicines, and debated causes. Apothecaries prepared compounds from herbs, minerals, animal products, spices, syrups, and electuaries. Some remedies helped with symptoms, others were ineffective or dangerous. The Queen's wealth gave her access to more treatment, not necessarily better outcomes. Dental pain is an example almost too ordinary to appear in royal chronicles, yet it must have shaped daily life. Tooth decay, abscesses, and gum disease existed. Sugar was expensive for much of the Middle Ages, but became increasingly prestigious in elite diets as trade expanded, and honey remained common. Dental extraction was possible, but anesthesia in the modern sense did not exist. Imagine sitting in a chamber while a practitioner prepares to pull a diseased tooth with metal instruments, attendants holding cloths, the household trying not to hear. Headaches, menstrual pain, digestive illness, arthritis, injuries from riding, respiratory infections, skin conditions and eye problems all occurred without modern painkillers. Opium-derived preparations existed in medical traditions, as did alcohol and herbs with sedative effects, but dosage and availability varied. Pain was interpreted through religion and medicine. Endurance could be praised as spiritual discipline. For a queen expected to appear serene, admitting weakness could have political consequences. Mental suffering was even harder to name. Medieval people possessed emotional vocabularies: melancholy, grief, fear, despair, spiritual desolation, but not modern psychiatric categories. A queen experiencing what we might now describe as depression, trauma, or anxiety lived in a world that could interpret symptoms morally, spiritually, physically, or astrologically. Confessors, physicians, relatives, and attendants offered different explanations. None could give her the conceptual privacy of saying simply, "I cannot cope." And the court rarely stopped demanding. A feast could be scheduled on the day she wanted only to sleep. A delegation might arrive while she was mourning. A saint's procession might require hours on her feet when pregnancy made every step uncomfortable. A tournament could fill the courtyard with trumpets and cheering, while a child lay sick in another room. The Queen's emotional life had to coexist with a calendar that belonged to the crown. Court entertainment was not optional amusement in the modern sense. Music, storytelling, dancing, hunting, falconry, tournaments, and seasonal festivities strengthened political relationships. A queen who sponsored musicians or poets built cultural prestige. A dance allowed nobles to display grace and hierarchy. A hunt gathered the elite outside formal council, while conversations unfolded on horseback. A Christmas feast demonstrated abundance. Pleasure itself served government. That did not mean no one enjoyed it. Medieval queens laughed, played games, listened to songs, exchanged gifts, admired gardens, kept pets, enjoyed clever stories, and formed friendships. The danger in describing royal life as pure misery is to flatten real people into victims who never experienced delight. Their world contained beauty, illuminated manuscripts shimmering with gold leaf, chapel music echoing beneath vaulted roofs, hawks rising into a winter sky, orchards in spring, imported fabrics, spiced wine, polished ivory, carved chests, and candlelight reflecting from silver. The misery lay not in the absence of pleasure, but in how rarely pleasure belonged only to the woman experiencing it. Even the garden could be watched. Enclosed gardens offered elite women a degree of retreat, with herbs, flowers, fruit trees, fountains, benches, and shaded walks depending on climate and wealth. Literary culture made the garden a symbol of love and refinement, yet a queen strolling among roses was still accompanied. A private conversation with a lady might later reach someone else. A messenger could interrupt. A bell could summon her to chapel. A servant could remind her that ambassadors were waiting. Hunting was freer and more dangerous. Noble women rode, hunted with hawks, and participated in aristocratic field sports. Falconry demanded skill. A queen could ride out wearing fine but practical clothing, a bird on her gloved hand, surrounded by horses, hounds, falconers, ladies and guards. The open air offered movement beyond stone walls, but riding accidents were real. Horses stumbled, saddles shifted, branches struck faces, weather changed. A pregnant queen riding over rough ground faced risks that would make a modern obstetrician uneasy. The horse was central to royal life. Palfreys, prized for smoother gaits, were especially suitable for comfortable riding, while other horses served hunting, travel, war, carts, and ceremony. A queen's stable represented enormous expense. Grooms cared for animals day and night. Saddles and harnesses displayed wealth. When a royal party entered a city, horses extended the visual language of monarchy. Polished tack, embroidered cloth, bells, colours, and controlled movement. But horses also meant smell, mud, flies, noise, and injury. A royal courtyard could be crowded with animals and servants. Manure had to be removed. Hooves struck stone. Wagons jammed gates. The Queen's grand progress through the realm depended on an infrastructure that was profoundly physical. A progress could last weeks or months. Royal mobility distributed the burden of feeding the court among estates, allowed rulers to inspect territories, reinforced authority, and offered hunting opportunities. Yet moving a queen's household was like relocating a village. Beds, hangings, clothes, documents, chapel equipment, cooking vessels, medicine, plate, food supplies, and personal objects travelled in carts or on pack animals. Roads damaged wheels, rivers delayed convoys, items were lost. Servants became sick, inns could not hold everyone, so religious houses, castles, manor houses, and temporary lodgings absorbed the moving population. When the Queen stayed in a monastery or abbey, the religious community's routine could be disrupted by royal hospitality. Feeding dozens or hundreds of extra mouths strained stores. Royal visits were honours, but honours could be expensive. The Queen entered spaces that seemed peaceful from the outside, yet depended on intense logistical preparation from people beneath her rank. Every comfort had an invisible human cost. The warm bed required foresters cutting wood, carters transporting it, servants stacking it, and chamber staff keeping the fire alive. The embroidered gown required sheep, dyers, merchants, spinners, weavers, tailors, and perhaps imported silk or fur carried across continents. The pepper on the table linked the Queen's dinner to merchants, ports, caravans, and distant producers she would never see. Royal daily life sat at the top of networks far larger than the palace. This is where the story expands beyond one woman. Medieval queens lived amid societies where most people worked the land. Peasants produced grain, livestock, wool, wine, vegetables, and rents that sustained castles and courts. Townspeople made shoes, barrels, metalwork, cloth, candles, parchment, furniture, and hundreds of other necessities. Merchants moved luxury goods. Tax collectors converted agricultural and urban wealth into royal revenue. A queen's jewel box and a peasant's harvest were connected by institutions of lordship, taxation, rent, and trade. Queens sometimes encountered ordinary subjects directly. On progress, they saw villages, market squares, ruined roads, beggars, clergy, and crowds. Royal entries transformed cities. Citizens decorated streets with cloth, painted structures, fountains, pageants, biblical scenes, allegories, and speeches. A new queen entering her husband's capital might see an idealized city created for one day. Clean routes, ceremonial gates, children singing, officials in formal robes. Behind the display lay crowded neighborhoods, open drains, workshops, taverns, slaughter areas, and the ordinary chaos of urban life. A queen had to read these pageants politically. Allegorical figures could praise her beauty, fertility, peacemaking role, or ancestry. A city might use the occasion to remind the crown of liberties and privileges. Gifts were rarely just gifts. A golden cup, purse of coins, or ceremonial object expressed loyalty while creating obligation. The queen's image also travelled where she did not. Coins rarely featured queens in the same way as kings, depending on kingdom and period, but seals, manuscripts, tombs, genealogies, and heraldry constructed dynastic identity. Her coat of arms might combine her birth family with her husband's line. Her marriage joined visual symbols as well as territories. Her seal mattered because it turned her authority into a physical impression in wax. A queen sealing a charter participated in legal and political action. The object could depict her standing crowned, holding symbols of rank, or incorporate heraldic imagery. The real woman might be tired, pregnant, aging, or ill, but the seal presented permanence, composed, legitimate, royal. That gap between image and body grew wider with age. Medieval queens who survived repeated pregnancies and disease, aged without modern dentistry, antibiotics, hormonal therapy, corrective surgery, or reliable treatment for chronic pain. Hair thinned or greyed, teeth broke, joints stiffened, eyesight failed. Yet ceremony still demanded presentation. A crown did not become lighter because the neck beneath it hurt. Crowns themselves were uncomfortable objects. We should be cautious about imagining a queen wearing a huge ceremonial crown all day. Crowns were used for particular occasions, while circlets and other head ornaments varied. But major coronations and feasts involved heavy garments, jewellery, mantles, and headpieces. A coronation could require long periods of standing, kneeling, processing, anointing, listening to liturgy, and sitting in formal state. The coronation offered one of the brightest moments of queenship and one of the clearest demonstrations that her body no longer belonged solely to her. Before nobles, clergy, and crowds, she was transformed from foreign princess or royal bride into sacred consort. Depending on kingdom and period, she might be anointed with holy oil, crowned, presented with symbolic objects, and led through a liturgy shaped by theology. The ritual suggested divine order. The woman inside it might have slept only a few hours. Afterward came feasting, receiving homage, changing garments, public appearances, and perhaps days of celebration. Every eye sought signs. Did the king treat her warmly? Did she carry herself with confidence? Was her household impressive? Were her relatives favoured? Her reign could begin under scrutiny before she had learned the corridors of her new home. For a young queen, the wedding night could be the most frightening threshold of all. Medieval royal marriages had to be consummated to achieve their expected dynastic purpose, and political communities cared about the fact of consummation, even when they did not witness the sexual act itself. Bedding ceremonies varied, but in some settings attendants accompanied the couple to bed, offered blessings, or performed rituals emphasizing that this union belonged to more than two people. The bride might be a teenager. The groom might be significantly older. They might share no language of intimacy, regardless of whether they shared spoken languages. Her education had prepared her to be obedient, pious, graceful, and dynastically useful. It could not guarantee affection. Sexual coercion within marriage is difficult to reconstruct from medieval sources because legal and theological concepts differed radically from modern consent frameworks. Canon law recognized marital obligations and certain limits, but wives generally existed within strongly patriarchal systems. A queen's rank did not erase that reality. To say this carefully is important. We cannot assume every royal marriage was violent, and evidence of tenderness is real. But we also should not romanticize arranged adolescent marriages simply because chroniclers described magnificent weddings. The next morning, servants returned. If the queen conceived quickly, she earned relief. If not, attention sharpened. Months passed. Physicians discussed causes, clergy recommended prayers, relics associated with fertility might be sought, pilgrimages could be undertaken or sponsored. The queen might donate to shrines, her mother might send advice, her husband's relatives might become impatient. Infertility exposed the unequal logic of dynastic marriage. Medieval medical texts could attribute infertility to either sex, but social blame often fell heavily on women because pregnancy was visible and queenship was explicitly reproductive. A king who produced children with mistresses could use that fact socially as evidence of his fertility, however unreliable the logic. The queen had no equivalent way to prove herself without committing the very adultery that could lead to political destruction. When a marriage remained childless, rumours could become vicious. Was she cursed? Too cold in complexion? Too devout? Too proud? Did she secretly use contraception? Was the marriage unconsummated? Had hidden sin offended God? The queen's womb became a national theory. Pregnancy, when it came, did not end fear, it relocated it. A medieval woman could know she was pregnant through bodily changes, but precise dating was uncertain. There was no ultrasound, fetal monitor, blood test, or modern emergency obstetric care. Quickening, the first felt movements of the fetus, was a significant experience. Until then, pregnancy could feel like an unstable promise. Miscarriage was common, though medieval records are incomplete and terminology can be ambiguous. For a queen, loss meant physical pain followed by political disappointment. Depending on gestational stage and circumstances, the event might be treated medically and spiritually in different ways. The household knew, rumour escaped, another cycle began. A successful birth brought a new danger, separation. Royal children often had their own households, or were placed with nurses and attendants in residences considered healthier than crowded courts. This was practical and aristocratic custom, not evidence that parents lacked affection, but it meant a queen might give birth after months of fear and then see her infant only periodically. Wet nurses were selected with great care because medieval people believed milk transmitted physical and moral qualities. Medical writers advised on the nurse's health, age, temperament, diet, and appearance. A woman of lower social status might live close to the royal infant and become indispensable. Her own body literally sustained the dynasty, yet her name might survive only in an account book. The nursery was full of such invisible women. Rockers, nurses, laundresses, chamber attendants and servants handled the repetitive labour of infancy. They washed linen, soothed crying, carried babies, managed sickness, and watched first steps. The queen remained mother, but royal motherhood was distributed through a household. If the baby was a prince, ceremony surrounded him almost immediately. Baptism could occur quickly because fear of infant death made the sacrament urgent. Godparents were chosen for political reasons. Gifts were exchanged. Names linked the child to saints and ancestors. The infant, who could barely focus his eyes, already occupied a place in diplomacy. A princess also mattered. Daughters carried alliances outward. Their marriages could secure peace, claims, trade, or military support. A queen might watch a daughter reach adolescence, knowing that the same departure she once endured would soon happen again. The girl would leave with trunks, attendants, and instructions. Her mother might never see her again. Distance could turn family love into correspondence. Letters crossed seas, messengers carried small gifts, devotional objects, cloth, news of pregnancies, illnesses, and deaths. A queen could maintain a daughter's presence through parchment, but not touch. Modern families complain when video calls fail. Medieval royal mothers could wait months for a sentence confirming a child was alive. Sometimes daughters returned only in death. Bodies of high-status people might be transported long distances for burial, embalmed according to period practice, or divided in ways that allowed heart, viscera, and body to be interred separately. Medieval attitudes to the corpse were both practical and sacred. Royal funerals transformed decay into ceremony. A queen attended many funerals if she lived long enough. The death of a king triggered a crisis of ritual and power. Bells tolled, clergy prayed. The royal body was prepared. Black cloth could cover familiar spaces. Officers broke or transferred staffs of office. The new reign began almost immediately, because monarchy could not remain symbolically empty. For the widow, grief and calculation arrived together. Where would she live? What lands now belonged to her? Would the new king honour her dower? If the new king was her son, would she influence him? If he was a stepson or rival relative, would he treat her as a respected dowager or a political threat? Queen mothers often became formidable precisely because widowhood combined experience, family legitimacy, and property. Yet their position remained unstable. A mother too involved in her adult son's government could be accused of controlling him. A mother excluded from court could lose patronage and income. Maternal authority had no fixed constitutional boundary. The death of a son was worse. For a queen, it could be both the deepest private loss and the collapse of a political future. Catherine of Aragon lies just beyond the medieval period in the early Tudor era, but her repeated pregnancies and losses show how dynastic maternity could become an extended public tragedy. Medieval queens knew the same pattern. A cradle becoming empty could alter succession calculations before the mother had left childbed. The emotional expectation to accept death through Christian faith could offer comfort and create pressure. The dead were not considered simply gone. Prayers, masses, alms, chantries, and memorial foundations helped the living maintain relationships with souls in the afterlife. A queen could endow a religious house to pray perpetually for a dead husband or child. Grief became architecture. Some of the most beautiful medieval monuments grew from loss. Eleanor of Castile's funeral crosses, Blanche of Castile's religious patronage, royal tombs in Westminster, Saint-Denis, and other dynastic centres turned mourning into stone, metal, paint, and prayer. Today, tourists walk past them in minutes. For the women who commissioned or inspired them, these were attempts to make memories survive a world where bodies disappeared quickly. The Queen's Chapel was one of the few spaces where suffering could be expressed without appearing politically weak. Kneeling before an image of the Virgin Mary, she confronted a sacred figure who was simultaneously queen, mother, intercessor, and grieving parent. Marian devotion had profound resonance for medieval women. The Virgin offered an ideal impossible to match, pure, obedient, maternal, exalted, and a figure through whom pain could be understood. Saints also provided specialized hope. Margaret of Antioch became associated with childbirth in medieval Europe. Relics, prayers, written charms, and girdles connected laboring women to sacred protection. Even royal women who possessed physicians and costly medicines turned toward the supernatural because childbirth made the limits of human skill obvious. Religion structured fear of death more generally. Queens funded masses because purgatory, increasingly articulated in medieval theology, made post-mortem purification feel concrete. Time after death could be affected by prayers of the living. To endow a chaplain was not just charity, it was spiritual insurance. A queen's account books therefore record expenses that make little sense if we separate economics from eternity. A jewel could be pawned to fund war. A manor could support a convent. A bolt of cloth could reward a servant. A silver cup could seal a friendship. Wealth circulated through relationships. The queen did not simply own treasure in a modern consumer sense. Objects carried memory, obligation, and political purpose. Jewels were especially mobile. A necklace could be part of a dowry, worn at a coronation, pledged for a loan, given to a daughter, then melted down by a later generation. Few royal objects survived intact because precious materials invited reuse. The glittering medieval crown preserved in a museum today is the exception, not the rule. That helps explain why royal households generated meticulous accounts. Clerks recorded fabric purchases, gifts, wages, travel expenses, arms, repairs, and food. These documents sometimes give us more intimate access to queens than chronicles do. A hostile chronicler might call a queen greedy or domineering. An account book shows that on a Tuesday someone purchased linen for her chamber, paid a messenger to carry a letter to her daughter, bought medicine from an apothecary, and tipped a woman who brought a rare fruit. History becomes human in those details. The queen is no longer a figure in a stained glass window. She is a person waiting for clean sheets. Laundry was relentless. Linen worn next to the skin absorbed sweat and oils. Changing it regularly was a major component of elite cleanliness. Laundresses washed, boiled, beat, rinsed, dried, folded, and mended cloth. Water sources mattered. Fuel mattered. Weather mattered. A queen could possess enormous wardrobes, but maintaining them required armies of hands. Fine outer garments could not simply be thrown into hot water. They were brushed, aired, spot-cleaned, repaired, and protected. Fur needed care. Moths threatened stored textiles. Chests used herbs or aromatic materials. Garments travelled with the household, accumulating wear from carts, rain, smoke, and constant use. The wardrobe also encoded hierarchy within the queen's female circle. Ladies might receive cast-off clothing or fabric as gifts. Such gifts were valuable and personal. To give a favoured woman a gown could signal intimacy and status. It might also produce jealousy. Court friendship rarely existed outside patronage. Ladies-in-waiting were companions, servants, political intermediaries, and potential spies all at once. They could come from leading noble families, meaning their fathers, brothers, and husbands had interests at court. A queen needed them. She also had to manage them. Favouring one family risked alienating another. A lady's marriage could require the queen's involvement. A conflict between two attendants could become factional. A pregnancy outside marriage could become scandal. If a lady carried a message secretly, the queen might be blamed. The intimate female household was political, precisely because outsiders imagined it as private. Male officials controlled other parts of the queen's establishment. Her chancellor, treasurer, clerks, stewards, and estate managers handled legal and financial affairs. Depending on the period, the queen possessed lands assigned for her maintenance, revenues from towns or customs, and rights over estates. Managing them required negotiation with local officials who might delay, resist, or exploit royal distance. Income could be large on parchment and inadequate in cash. Medieval finance often relied on assigned revenues that arrived irregularly. Kings themselves were frequently short of ready money. Queens could accumulate debts to merchants, goldsmiths, tailors, and household suppliers. A magnificent court might owe money everywhere. Debt constrained freedom. A merchant who supplied silk expected payment. A servant whose wages were months late became resentful. A queen might petition the king for additional funds or pressure officials to release revenues. Financial dependence could turn marital tension into administrative crisis. Some queens brought enormous dowries, but dowries were not simple bank transfers. They could include cash, territory, claims, rights, or staged payments. Disputes over unpaid dowries lasted years. A woman could become the living symbol of a financial promise her father's government had not fulfilled. Territorial dowries could be even more explosive. A marriage intended to end war might transfer disputed lands, leaving local nobles angry. The queen then became associated with concessions. If war resumed, her birthplace became enemy territory, while her dowry became a grievance. This was the logic behind many European dynastic marriages. Peace was personalized in a bride. When peace failed, the bride remained. Queens were therefore trained from childhood for emotional self-control. Royal daughters learned religion, etiquette, household skills, languages, music, needlework, and dynastic history, according to family resources and local tradition. They observed mothers and female relatives navigating court. They learned that tears could be private, but appearances were public. Childhood itself could be formal. A princess might have her own attendants early. She was addressed according to rank. Her playmates could be selected for political reasons. At 7 or 8, discussions of marriage might already be underway. Betrothals could be arranged and broken as alliances shifted. The child knew adults were discussing her future, even if she could not grasp its scale. 1 year she might be promised to a prince in France, 2 years later to a king in Iberia. Then negotiations collapsed because an army crossed a border. Her identity was provisional. Education could empower her. Some medieval queens were highly literate and politically informed. Matilda of Scotland, wife of Henry I of England, was educated in a convent and acted as an important patron. Eleanor of Aquitaine belonged to a sophisticated courtly culture. Isabella of France grew up in the Capetian court. Margaret of Anjou came from a dynastic environment saturated with claims, diplomacy, and war. Yet education also prepared women to survive constraints rather than escape them. A princess learned how to host, how to pray, how to manage servants, how to recognize precedents, how to write or dictate formal letters, how to flatter without surrendering dignity, how to hear insult without reacting too quickly. These skills sound ornamental until the wrong response could offend an ambassador. Food etiquette provides a small example. A queen at a banquet might receive a special dish before others. Accepting it graciously honoured the host. Refusing because she disliked the taste could create a story. She therefore learned to taste, smile, and kin to. This discipline extended to physical discomfort. Ceremonial gowns could be heavy, churches could be cold, processions could be long, pregnancy could cause nausea, a tooth could throb, menstrual cramps could twist the abdomen. Yet public ritual assumed a stable body. Modern celebrity culture offers a distant analogy. Every appearance photographed, every facial expression interpreted, every outfit discussed. But a medieval queen faced this scrutiny without mass media, and with higher constitutional stakes. Rumour did not need millions of viewers to be dangerous. It needed one chronicler, one hostile baron, one ambassador, or one suspicious husband. Chroniclers were rarely neutral. Monks, clerics, court writers, and later historians shaped queenly reputations according to political loyalties and gender expectations. A queen who intervened in government might be described as wise by supporters and scheming by enemies. A king's mistress could be blamed for corruption. A foreign queen could be blamed for imported luxury. These narratives hardened over time until modern audiences mistake propaganda for personality. Margaret of Anjou is a case in point. Shakespeare, writing long after her lifetime, helped create an enduring image of ferocity. The historical Margaret certainly acted forcefully during civil war, but the cultural horror at a politically active queen amplified her actions. A man defending his son's inheritance might be called determined. A woman doing so could become monstrous. The same double standard affected mercy. Queens were expected to intercede because feminine compassion softened masculine justice. But if a queen successfully saved too many allies, enemies could accuse her of manipulating the king. Her virtue could become evidence against her. Even motherhood could be weaponized. A politically active queen might be dismissed as merely acting for her son. If she did not act for him, she could be condemned as a bad mother. No choice escaped interpretation. The queen's body was also read symbolically. Pregnancy meant divine favour. Infertility could mean divine displeasure. Illness could be moralized. Beauty could be evidence of virtue in flattering literature, or of dangerous sexuality in hostile writing. Physical reality disappeared beneath metaphor. Consider the simple experience of morning sickness. A woman wakes nauseated, perhaps vomiting, unable to tolerate food. In a modern private home, this is unpleasant but ordinary. In a royal household, servants notice what she refuses to eat. Ladies exchange glances. A physician is summoned. A chaplain offers prayer. An ambassador hears a rumour. Within days, another kingdom may be calculating the possible birth date of an heir. There is almost something claustrophobic about it. The Queen lives in rooms larger than most homes, yet her personal world grows smaller as her importance grows. Security intensified that claustrophobia. Royal women could be kidnapped, held hostage, or confined. Castles were not just residences, but instruments of custody. Political opponents understood the value of controlling a queen, especially if she had children or claims. Eleanor of Aquitaine's long confinement after the revolt of 1173–74 shows how quickly status could become imprisonment. Henry II did not throw her into a dungeon in chains. Her captivity was more controlled and aristocratic than popular imagination suggests. She had attendants and moved under supervision. That makes the situation more revealing, not less. A queen could live with servants, fine clothing, and appropriate food, while lacking the basic right to choose where she went. Confinement weaponized the ordinary structure of court life. The guards already existed, the attendants already surrounded her. Travel already required permission and logistics. To imprison a queen, a king did not need iron bars everywhere. He needed to control doors, horses, messengers, and visitors. Letters became contraband. News became rationed. A loyal servant became priceless. The same household system that enabled queenship could be turned inside out. A royal woman under suspicion had to wonder who among her attendants reported to the king. Loyalty in medieval courts was rarely simple because servants depended on wages and patrons. A lady could love the queen and still have a father who ordered her to reveal information. A clerk could serve the queen while seeking advancement from the king. Human relationships existed inside feudal and household obligations. At the opposite extreme, a queen acting as regent could suddenly command those same networks. She issued orders, authorized payments, met councils, and corresponded with commanders. Yet regency was exhausting because it combined the queen's existing duties with the king's political burden. If her husband was absent on crusade, the stakes expanded. Crusading kings left behind debts, factions, and uncertain successions. News from the eastern Mediterranean travelled slowly. A queen or queen mother might not know whether the king was alive. The realm still needed decisions. The crusading movement touched queens directly in other ways. Eleanor of Aquitaine accompanied Louis VII on the Second Crusade, an extraordinary episode later wrapped in legend. The journey to the eastern Mediterranean exposed royal women to heat, disease, military uncertainty, and political tension far beyond ordinary court travel. Eleanor's presence became fodder for scandalous stories, many difficult to substantiate. Again, the pattern is familiar. When a queen entered spaces coded as masculine, war, strategy, long-distance expedition, later narratives sexualized or condemned her. Other royal women supported crusades from home, raised funds, acted as regents, or negotiated ransoms. Blanche of Castile had to help manage the consequences of Louis IX's crusading ambitions. Crusade was presented as sacred warfare, but for royal families it could mean years of separation and crushing expense. Ransom itself could bankrupt politics. When a king was captured, huge sums might be demanded. Taxes increased. Church treasure, plate, and jewels could be mobilized. The Queen's personal valuables suddenly became part of national finance. The royal household therefore lived close to the machinery of extraction. Taxes were not abstract. They paid soldiers, weddings, embassies, ransoms, castles, and court. When subjects resisted taxation, the Queen might become a target if people associated her with luxury or foreign expenditure. Popular rebellion could bring frightening proximity between palace and street. During the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, rebels entered London and attacked symbols of royal government. The young Richard II faced the crisis directly. His mother, Joan of Kent, though not a queen consort at that time, experienced the insecurity surrounding royal family members in a capital suddenly transformed by mass revolt. Events like this reminded every court that castle walls and rank did not make anger disappear. Urban crowds were unpredictable in other contexts too. A royal entry could be ecstatic, but bread shortages or war defeats could change mood. Queens depended on reputation. Charity and ceremony helped construct legitimacy because monarchy required emotional relationships with subjects, not only force. The Queen's face was part of that relationship. She was expected to appear benevolent. When petitioners knelt, she listened. When children presented flowers, she accepted them. When a city offered gifts, she thanked officials. A spontaneous grimace could become arrogance in retelling. Pregnancy made these performances particularly punishing. A queen in late pregnancy might still attend ceremonies until confinement. Swollen feet, back pain, heartburn, shortness of breath, fatigue and frequent urination were no less real in the 13th century than now. The difference was that royal protocol wrapped them in velvet. Imagine a procession through a cathedral. Incense thickens the air. The Queen's gown presses on her ribs. A jewelled belt has been loosened but still feels tight. She has stood through prayers for what seems like hours. The child moves hard beneath her stomach. Nobles watch from both sides. She cannot quietly slip out without everyone noticing. Then imagine doing this after losing 3 children. That repetition defined many royal women's lives. A genealogy compresses it into neat lines. Born, married, issue, died. The lived experience was cyclical. Each pregnancy reopened every fear from the last one. Childbirth could also destroy continence, pelvic health, or sexual comfort through injuries rarely recorded explicitly. Severe perineal tears, prolapse, fistula, chronic pain, and infection must have occurred. Elite women might receive more attentive care, but surgery and repair were limited. A queen could survive labour and carry consequences for the rest of her life, while chronicles simply wrote that she recovered. Postpartum mental health conditions likewise leave little clear evidence, but biology did not begin in modernity. Sleep deprivation, hormonal shifts, grief, fear and trauma affected medieval mothers. The palace would interpret those experiences using its own language. Weakness, melancholy, spiritual trial, fever, imbalance. Recovery was expected to culminate in ritual return. In Christian Europe, women commonly underwent a churching ceremony after childbirth, though timing and meaning varied. The ritual gave thanks for survival and marked re-entry into public religious life. For a queen, it could become another public appearance, layered over private recovery. If she emerged carrying the symbolic success of a living son, celebrations surrounded her. If the baby had died, the same church could feel different. Bells still rang, clergy still chanted, the Queen still walked. The court had little patience for prolonged withdrawal because succession kept moving. Political marriages for surviving children needed negotiation. A daughter approached marriageable age, a son needed tutors, a rival noble demanded appointment, a papal legate arrived, harvest revenues declined, the king prepared for war. Royal women could sometimes influence war by advocating peace. The Queen as peacemaker was a powerful medieval ideal because marriage linked rival dynasties. Philippa of Hainault is famously associated with the story of the burghers of Calais in 1347, when, according to the chronicler Jean Froissart, she pleaded with Edward III to spare 6 citizens who had offered themselves after the siege. Historians debate details and literary shaping, but the episode became iconic because it fit the expected role of queenly intercession, feminine mercy, tempering royal vengeance. That role, however, depended on proximity to male authority. A queen could ask. The king decided. Her power was strongest when he listened. When he did not, intercession became humiliation. Imagine kneeling publicly, asking mercy for a relative or servant, and hearing refusal. Everyone present learned the limits of your influence. The same was true in private. Petitioners came to queens precisely because they believed she could soften the king. Each request placed her reputation at stake. If she promised too much, she failed. If she refused too often, she lost a network of gratitude. Patronage was a daily burden disguised as privilege. Hundreds of people wanted offices, pensions, marriages, legal favours, licenses, introductions, or gifts. Every appointment benefited one family and disappointed 5 others. The Queen's household became a marketplace of hope. Servants watched her preferences because preference predicted advancement. Which chaplain did she trust? Which lady received a jewel? Which knight escorted her most often? Favour became measurable. That made genuine friendship difficult to separate from ambition. A queen could certainly love her attendants, but she knew proximity to her was valuable. If she complained about the king to a trusted woman, was the woman comforting her or collecting dangerous knowledge? Courtly love literature makes medieval aristocratic life seem romantic. Secret glances, songs, gardens, noble devotion. Real queens lived in the shadow of that literary culture, but the political cost of an actual affair was enormous. Poetry celebrated longing precisely because fulfillment could be dangerous. Music offered safer intimacy. Harps, fiddles, flutes, voices, and later keyboard instruments filled elite chambers. A song in a familiar language could remind a foreign queen of home. Musicians from her birthplace might be especially treasured. For a few minutes, identity could stretch beyond marriage. Food did the same. A queen might bring culinary preferences with her attendants and cooks. Foreign sauces, preparation methods, or sweets entered new courts through marriage. Critics could mock them as extravagance. The queen's nostalgia became cultural politics. Smell carried memory as well. A particular incense, herb, perfume, baked dish, wine, or flower could recall childhood. Medieval people lived in a sensory world saturated with smoke, animals, earth, cloth, spices, and human presence. Royal luxury intensified scent rather than eliminating it. Musk, rosewater, lavender, rosemary, and imported aromatics competed with damp stone and crowded bodies. Perfume was not merely cosmetic. Pleasant scents were associated with health because miasmatic ideas connected foul air with disease. During epidemics, aromatic substances gained protective significance. A queen might carry scented pomanders or use herbs in rooms, especially in later medieval and early modern contexts. Windows did not provide modern ventilation. Glazed windows existed in elite architecture, but glass was expensive and openings were often small. Shutters controlled wind and light. Fires produced smoke. Tapestries trapped warmth. Crowded rooms became heavy with breath. Winter was the palace's enemy. Even rich households struggled to heat large stone structures. Fireplaces warmed zones, not entire buildings. Clothing provided much of the insulation. Fur-lined garments, caps, layered bedding, bed curtains, and portable braziers helped. People clustered near heat. A queen waking in January could step from a warm bed enclosure into air cold enough to see her breath. Water for washing might cool rapidly. Stone floors bit through slippers. Church services could last in unheated spaces. Hands stiffened during prayer. Summer brought different discomforts. Flies gathered near kitchens and stables. Food spoiled faster. Rooms became stuffy. Travel raised dust. Wells could run low or become contaminated. Epidemics often followed seasonal patterns people only partly understood. Fire was a constant danger in every season. Candles, torches, hearths, braziers, wooden roofs, rushes, textiles, and crowded buildings created risk. Royal palaces suffered fires. A spark in hanging cloth could transform a chamber into panic before organised firefighting existed. At night, servants were responsible for extinguishing or controlling flames. The queen depended on their vigilance while she slept. One careless ember could erase a residence. The palace was also vulnerable to theft. Jewels, silver, food, cloth, and candles were valuable. Household ordinances attempted to regulate access and accountability. Chests had locks. Keys became symbols of trust. A queen's chamber staff might inventory objects because missing items could cause accusations. Keys are a useful image for medieval queenship. The queen might possess keys to chests filled with treasure, but not the key to the gate that determined whether she could leave. When she did leave, danger returned. Rivers had to be crossed, Ships had to sail. Sea travel terrified even experienced travellers. Storms could scatter fleets. Seasickness reduced nobility to helplessness. Piracy and war complicated routes. Royal brides frequently crossed the English Channel, the Bay of Biscay, the Mediterranean, or northern seas. Imagine a teenage princess vomiting in a cramped cabin, while her attendants pray and sailors shout above deck. The marriage treaty waits on the other shore. Turning back is not a choice. Shipboard privacy was minimal. Space was limited, bedding dampened, food deteriorated. Fresh water had to be conserved. Toileting was awkward. The Queen's rank changed the quality of accommodation, but could not change the motion of the sea. Once ashore, another ceremonial welcome began. The medieval Queen's life was therefore a sequence of thresholds: bedroom to chapel, palace to road, girlhood to marriage, wife to mother, mother to widow, private pain to public appearance. Each threshold demanded transformation. She was expected to move through them without losing composure, and beneath all those thresholds was the calendar, turning whether she was ready or not. Medieval court life followed liturgical seasons as much as political ones. Advent brought preparation and restraint. Christmas brought feasting, gift-giving, music and crowded halls. Lent changed the diet and intensified devotion. Easter demanded ceremony. Saints' days punctuated the year. Royal birthdays, weddings, baptisms, tournaments, embassies, parliaments, councils, hunts, funerals, and military campaigns filled the spaces between. The Queen did not control the rhythm, she inhabited it. A modern person can cancel dinner plans because of a headache. A queen could be expected to receive an ambassador while feverish because the ambassador had crossed half a continent and the political message could not wait. She might sit propped beneath a canopy, face powdered or veiled by dim candlelight, and let formal language cover physical weakness. The representative would leave and report not only her words, but her appearance: pale, cheerful, thin, visibly pregnant, troubled, confident. Her health itself became intelligence. Ambassadors were trained observers. They noticed who stood near the Queen, how long she spoke with the king, whether she attended dinner, whether she wore mourning, whether a royal child appeared healthy. They listened to servants and merchants. Some of the most intimate details of court life survive because foreign governments wanted them. A queen could not know which casual gesture would become a line in a dispatch carried hundreds of miles away. Diplomacy reached her through ceremony and through family. A visiting envoy from her homeland might bring letters from a mother she had not seen in years. He might also demand that she persuade her husband to change policy. The same meeting contained homesickness and statecraft. She had to read the letter as daughter and answer as queen. If her husband's kingdom went to war with her brothers, the contradiction became unbearable. Medieval dynasties were interwoven. Cousins fought cousins, sisters became queens on opposing sides of borders. A woman could pray for her husband's victory, knowing that victory might mean the defeat or capture of her own kin. War also invaded household economics. Campaigns consumed horses, grain, metal, cloth, wages, and credit. Kings borrowed heavily. Queens could be asked to surrender jewels or revenues. Ceremonial plate might be pawned. Merchants who had supplied the royal wardrobe now became lenders to the state. Luxury objects stopped being decoration and became emergency currency. The Queen's estates could suffer directly. Soldiers marched across fields, tenants fled, harvests failed. Officials sent reports of burned villages or unpaid rents. She might never see the damage herself, but the consequences appeared in her accounts as missing income. A jewelled chamber in the capital could therefore be linked to a devastated manor 200 miles away. Estate management was not glamorous, yet it could occupy enormous attention. Medieval queens received dower lands or other holdings meant to sustain their households. Those lands contained villages, mills, woods, fisheries, market rights, courts, tenants, and local disputes. Officials collected rents, enforced customary obligations, leased property, repaired bridges, managed forests, and dealt with crime. The Queen's name stood at the top of a system experienced at ground level by ordinary people. Petitions from those estates could reach her household. A widow might ask relief from a payment. A town might request confirmation of privileges. A monastery might contest a boundary. A steward might be accused of corruption. The Queen could not personally investigate everything. She depended on men whose reports could be incomplete or self-serving. This dependence was fundamental. Royal authority looked absolute from a distance, but was mediated through hundreds of officials. A command had to be written, sealed, carried, understood, and enforced. At each stage, another person gained the opportunity to delay or reinterpret it. A queen's power was therefore partly the power to make people care about carrying out her wishes. That required patronage, memory, and emotional intelligence. She remembered which family had served her at a difficult moment. She rewarded a clerk's loyalty. She sent a gift when a noblewoman gave birth. She wrote condolences after a death. She stood godmother to children. She arranged marriages. Politics lived inside relationships. It also lived inside the architecture. A great hall was public. A chamber was selective. A withdrawing room, where it existed in later medieval domestic arrangements, was more restricted. Doorways created hierarchy. To be admitted through one more door meant access. The Queen's personal apartments became a map of political intimacy. Servants controlled that map. An usher could delay a petitioner. A lady could whisper that the Queen was tired. A chamberlain could decide when a message reached her. The person guarding a door might be socially far beneath the nobleman waiting outside, yet for that moment, the servant possessed power over him. This was why household appointments mattered so much. Nobles competed to place relatives near the royal family. A young aristocratic woman serving the Queen gained visibility and marriage prospects. A clerk in the Queen's administration gained contacts. A confessor gained access to conscience. Every role created a pathway toward influence. The Queen had to protect herself from capture by her own household. If one faction dominated her attendance, rivals assumed her politics matched theirs. If she replaced too many people, she appeared unstable or ungrateful. The management of servants became the management of perception. Occasionally, the danger was more literal. Medieval royal courts knew assassination, poisoning rumours, hostage-taking, and coups. Poison in particular occupied the imagination because it offered an invisible explanation for sudden death. Actual poisoning is difficult to prove in many famous cases, but fear of it shaped behaviour. Tasters, trusted cupbearers, controlled kitchens, and suspicion around medicines reflected a world where elite death could immediately benefit someone. Food poisoning, in the modern microbial sense, was probably a more ordinary threat. Meat, dairy, fish, water, and cooked dishes could become contaminated. A royal kitchen had resources and experienced staff, yet scale created vulnerability. Hundreds of meals had to be prepared without refrigeration. Salt, drying, smoking, pickling, and cool storage helped. So did seasonal supply chains. None eliminated risk. A stomach illness at court could spread rapidly. Servants shared rooms. Travellers carried infection. Guests arrived from different regions. Latrines and water systems varied in quality. The Queen could retreat from obvious sickness, but she could not create a sterile environment. During major epidemics, flight was one of the few strategies available. Courts moved away from infected towns. Royal residences outside cities became refuges, yet movement could carry disease too, and local populations feared incoming households. The Queen's safety might require exposing servants to dangerous roads and uncertain lodging. The Black Death made this vulnerability impossible to ignore. Beginning in 1347–48 in much of Europe, plague killed an extraordinary proportion of the population in successive waves. Medieval observers watched households collapse in days. Priests died administering sacraments. Burial systems broke down. Economic relationships shifted because labour became scarce. No royal tapestry could block a flea or bacterium no one understood. For queens, plague produced both fear and political consequences. Their servants died, their relatives died, marriage negotiations collapsed, town revenues fell, estates lacked workers, religious foundations received urgent donations, apocalyptic interpretations spread. A queen who had been taught that monarchy existed within divine order now watched entire communities vanish under a disease that did not recognize order at all. There were other epidemics too: dysentery, influenza-like illnesses, smallpox, and recurring fevers that sources describe with imprecise terminology. Smallpox was especially dangerous and could scar survivors. Beauty, already politically important, could change in a matter of weeks. A queen recovering from severe illness might emerge alive, but visibly altered, forcing a court obsessed with physical signs to reinterpret her face. Illness also exposed the intimacy of service. A queen too weak to stand had to be washed, changed, fed, and helped with bodily functions by attendants. Status did not reduce dependence, it multiplied the number of people present. Her dignity rested on servants pretending not to notice what they could not avoid seeing. The sick room could become a political chamber. Bishops visited, physicians argued, relatives waited, clerks prepared documents in case death came. If the queen possessed property or guardianship rights, legal questions arose before she had taken her last breath. A serious fever could turn affection into succession planning. When the king fell ill, the queen's burden increased further. She might sit at his bedside as wife, while factions gathered outside as political actors. Was he conscious? Could he issue commands? Who controlled the seal? Who had access to him? If he recovered, alliances made during the crisis would be remembered. If he died, the person who controlled the heir could control the future. Henry VI's periods of incapacity in 15th century England show how a king's health could destabilise an entire political system. Margaret of Anjou's position became inseparable from the question of who governed while her husband could not. Her enemies saw ambition, her supporters saw necessity. Daily life for her meant that domestic catastrophe and constitutional crisis were the same event. The birth of their son Edward in 1453 should have secured the dynasty. Instead, it intensified suspicion in a kingdom already divided. The child's legitimacy became a subject of hostile rumour. Henry's illness prevented the ordinary royal performance of fatherhood at the moment when public reassurance was needed most. Margaret's maternal protectiveness then fed political opposition. The Queen had achieved the task demanded of her, producing an heir, and found that success made her life more dangerous. That is perhaps the cruelest pattern in medieval queenship. The fulfillment of one expectation often created another trap. A beautiful bride attracted praise, but also sexual suspicion. A fertile queen gained status, but endured repeated dangerous pregnancies. A politically skilled queen protected the dynasty, but risked being called domineering. A wealthy queen attracted clients, but also accusations of extravagance. A pious queen gained moral authority, but could be mocked as controlled by clergy. A loving mother became vulnerable through her children. Children were hostages to politics in the broadest sense. Princes and princesses could be sent to other courts, promised in marriage, placed in noble households, or used to secure agreements. In wartime, control of a child with royal blood could determine claims to the throne. The Queen's instinct to keep children close collided with the dynasty's need to deploy them. A son reaching adolescence entered a dangerous world of male aristocratic culture. He learned riding, hunting, arms, lordship, and war. Accidents were common. A horse could fall. A training weapon could strike wrong. Disease could kill a healthy teenager in days. The Queen, who had survived childbirth, now watched her son deliberately enter physical danger because kingship required martial credibility. A daughter faced a different departure. Her wedding could be negotiated years in advance. The Queen supervised clothing, jewels, household appointments, and advice. She knew exactly what the girl feared, because she had once been that girl. She also knew she could not tell her to refuse. The farewell might be magnificent, Trumpets, embroidered saddles, priests, noble escorts, and wagons of possessions filled the road. The mother stood in public until the procession disappeared. Then she returned to rooms where the daughter's absence became permanent. Some royal women never saw their birth families again after marriage. Borders, war, expense, pregnancy, and obligation made return difficult. Home became a memory preserved in accent and prayer. That isolation helps explain why natal relatives at court mattered so deeply. A sister, cousin, or childhood attendant provided continuity. Yet local elites often resented them as foreigners. The Queen's attempt to protect her emotional health could look like political favoritism. Foreignness also affected religious practice in subtle ways. All Western Christian courts shared Latin liturgy, but local saints, devotional customs, pilgrimage sites, and musical traditions differed. A queen might promote saints from her homeland. She might introduce relics or artistic styles. Such cultural exchange enriched courts, but hostile observers could frame it as intrusion. The same applied to clothing. A sleeve cut differently, a headdress from another region, or a preference for a foreign fabric could inspire imitation. Fashion spread through marriage. Queens were cultural transmitters. That influence could make them admired trendsetters or convenient targets for complaints about moral decline. Moralists frequently criticized elite fashion. Long trains, tight garments, elaborate headdresses, pointed shoes, extravagant sleeves, and expensive textiles could be condemned as vanity. Women often received especially sharp criticism because female adornment was linked to sexuality and temptation. The Queen, therefore, embodied royal magnificence in a culture that preached humility. She could not solve the contradiction by dressing simply. Royal ceremony demanded visible hierarchy. Clothing told observers that the monarchy possessed wealth, stability, and divine favour. A queen in poor garments at a major diplomatic event could signal weakness. She had to display exactly the luxury preachers warned against. Jewellery created the same problem. Pearls, gemstones, gold, and enamel conveyed prestige. Medieval lapidary traditions also attributed symbolic or medicinal qualities to stones. Sapphires, rubies, emeralds, pearls, and diamonds carried meanings that varied across texts and periods. A jewel could be devotional, dynastic, financial, and aesthetic at once. Wearing it could be uncomfortable. Heavy necklaces pulled at the neck. Brooches pinned layers of cloth. Ceremonial mantles dragged. Rings crowded fingers. Head ornaments required pins and careful balance. The Queen appeared effortless, because servants had spent hours constructing the appearance. After the ceremony, they dismantled her again. This nightly undressing may have been one of the few moments when the public queen became physically ordinary. Pins came out, jewels were counted, veils were removed, outer gowns loosened, linen showed sweat, hair fell down, feet ached. Red marks remained where belts or shoes had pressed. The woman under the monarchy emerged, but even then attendants surrounded her. Bathing, when arranged, could offer physical relief. Elite medieval bathing culture never vanished as completely as later caricature suggests. Bathhouses existed in towns, though they attracted moral suspicion in some contexts, and private tubs could be prepared for wealthy households. Water might be scented with herbs or flowers. Linen-lined tubs. Food and drink could sometimes accompany bathing in aristocratic settings. Yet bathing required labour and fuel. Dozens of buckets might be carried upstairs. Fires heated water. Servants tested temperature. Afterward, the water had to go somewhere. The Queen's moment of warmth depended on sweating workers she might barely see. Hair care was similarly labour-intensive. Washing with water and cleansing preparations, combing, oiling or scenting, braiding and protecting hair demanded time. Portraits and manuscript images make elaborate female appearance seem natural. It was manufactured every day. Skincare involved oils, ointments, herbal washes and cosmetics, though attitudes toward cosmetic enhancement could be morally ambivalent. Pale complexions were admired in many elite contexts because they signalled status away from outdoor labour. Some later medieval and early modern preparations used ingredients we would now consider unsafe. Beauty could carry chemical risk as well as social pressure. The Queen's hands were highly visible. Rings drew attention to them. During rituals she received objects, gave alms, touched relics, accepted gifts, and gestured in conversation. Soft hands signalled elite status because they were spared agricultural labour, yet they were not idle. They turned manuscript pages, handled embroidery, signed or marked documents where custom permitted, held reins, managed prayer beads, and soothed children. Prayer beads were constant companions. Repeated prayers created rhythm in a life governed by uncertainty. A queen waiting for news from a battlefield could count prayers because she could not count surviving soldiers. A woman in labour could repeat sacred names because there was no monitor telling her whether the child was safe. Battle news arrived in fragments. A messenger galloped into a courtyard, mud-splashed and exhausted. Before he reached the Queen, officials might question him. Was the king alive? Who won? Which nobles were dead? Was the road safe? If the answer was unclear, rumour outran fact. The Queen's chamber could fill with contradictory stories. One servant heard the army had triumphed. Another heard the king was captured. A merchant said enemy banners had been seen near a town. The Queen had to decide whether to flee before certainty arrived. Flight stripped away ceremonial control. Valuable objects were packed quickly. Some were left behind. Children were awakened. Horses were saddled. Roads were chosen for security, not comfort. A queen who normally travelled beneath banners might move quietly to avoid detection. Margaret of Anjou spent years experiencing this instability during the Wars of the Roses. Victory and defeat alternated violently. After Lancastrian setbacks, she sought support in Scotland and on the continent. Her life became a geography of exile, negotiation, military return, and loss. In 1471, after the Battle of Tewkesbury, her only son Edward was killed. Soon after, Henry VI died in the Tower of London. Whatever one thinks of her political actions, the human result was devastating. Husband, son, and cause gone. The Queen reduced from central political actor to captive and eventually exile. The story exposes the fragility beneath monarchy. A queen could spend decades accumulating status, allies, possessions, and ceremonial precedents. One battle could erase nearly all of it before sunset. Exile brought a different misery. Royal identity depended on recognition. Abroad, a deposed or widowed queen might live on the charity or political calculations of relatives. Her household shrank. Debts grew. Servants left. Jewels were sold. Letters requesting money replaced commands. The emotional fall must have been severe. Imagine once entering cities beneath cloth of gold canopies and later waiting for a pension payment from a foreign king. The titles remained. The machinery disappeared. Some queens were restored to influence. Eleanor of Aquitaine emerged from confinement after Henry II's death in 1189 and became extraordinarily active under Richard I, travelling, arranging affairs, and helping preserve Plantagenet interests. In old age she crossed Europe on diplomatic missions connected to the marriages of her descendants. Her survival shows that medieval queens were not merely consumed by their circumstances. They could re-enter politics with astonishing resilience. But resilience had a physical price. Eleanor was in her 60s and 70s during some of these journeys, an advanced age for such travel in any era. Roads did not improve because she was famous. Winter did not soften. The body that had endured childbirth, crusade, political rebellion and imprisonment still had to sit in the saddle or carriage. Age could bring authority because an older queen had what a young bride lacked: knowledge of personalities, family networks, legal claims and ceremony. She had survived enough scandals to understand how rumours worked. She knew which officials could be trusted. She had children and grandchildren across Europe. Widowhood or motherhood might free her from immediate reproductive pressure. Yet age also made her vulnerable to illness and irrelevance. A new queen arrived at court. New favourites gained influence. The Queen Dowager's household could become a quieter world of prayer, estate management and memory. She watched younger women repeat the cycle. Perhaps she advised them. Medieval advice literature for women and princesses emphasized piety, obedience, household governance, charity, and reputation. Mothers wrote or transmitted practical wisdom. But advice had limits. No lesson could tell a girl how it would feel to leave home forever. No lesson could teach childbirth pain in advance. No etiquette manual could prepare a wife for a husband's hatred. No prayer guaranteed a child's survival. No marriage treaty guaranteed peace. That gap between preparation and reality is where much of the misery lived. There was also boredom, an emotion rarely considered in glamorous depictions of royalty. Court ritual involved waiting for mass, waiting for the king, waiting for meals, waiting while garments were fastened, waiting for messengers, waiting for weather to improve, waiting through formal speeches, waiting during pregnancy, waiting in confinement, waiting beside a sickbed, waiting for an army to return. A queen filled time with reading, sewing, music, conversation, games, prayer, and administration. But there must have been days when the rain struck shutters and no news came, when every corridor felt familiar, when the same ladies repeated the same gossip, when the crown's great drama reduced itself to hours of stillness. Winter intensified enclosure. Roads became difficult, days shortened, candles burned, outdoor activity decreased, damp settled into walls, respiratory illness spread. The Queen's world contracted to a sequence of heated rooms and cold passageways. Spring reopened roads and political activity. Messengers increased, hunts resumed, campaigning season approached, gardens changed, Lent ended, and Easter feasting returned. Then summer brought travel, war, marriages and progress. Autumn meant harvest calculations, estate revenues, preserving food, and preparation for winter. The agricultural cycle mattered even inside palaces. A poor harvest raised grain prices. A wet year affected rents. Livestock disease altered meat supply. Wine quality changed. Royal consumption could buffer shortages, but not erase them. If famine struck the wider population, the Queen's abundant table became morally and politically visible. The Great Famine of 1315–17 devastated large parts of northern Europe after years of severe weather and crop failure. Grain prices rose, livestock suffered, and hunger spread. Royal courts continued to function, but the crisis challenged every layer of society. A queen eating white bread in a palace existed in the same world as families grinding desperate substitutes into food. Charity during such crises carried real importance, though it could never solve structural scarcity. Almoners distributed food and money. Religious institutions fed the poor. Queens funded relief or granted favours. The image of the merciful queen became most powerful when suffering was visible at the gates. But mercy also revealed distance. The queen could hand a coin to a hungry woman and then return to a kitchen stocked with spices. Medieval society considered hierarchy natural in ways modern egalitarian cultures do not. Yet Christian teaching insisted the rich had obligations toward the poor. Queenship existed inside that tension. Holy Thursday rituals could dramatize humility. Rulers in some periods washed the feet of poor people, imitating Christ's service to the apostles. Royal women participated in forms of ceremonial charity. For a few minutes, the social order seemed reversed, the queen kneeling before someone impoverished. But the ritual's power came precisely from the fact that everyone knew she would rise still queen. The poor person returned to ordinary hardship. The queen returned to ordinary captivity of another kind. It is important not to equate those hardships. A medieval peasant woman faced labour, hunger, violence, disease, childbirth and legal vulnerability without royal resources. A queen's misery was not materially comparable to poverty. She had food when others starved, shelter when others slept in fragile houses, servants when others served, and influence when others had almost none. The point is not that queens suffered more, it is that privilege did not equal freedom. Their lives reveal how power can coexist with constraint. The queen could command a servant, but be commanded by dynasty. She could own estates, but not choose her husband. She could intercede for prisoners, but fail to protect herself. She could be the highest-ranking woman in the realm and still be judged primarily by whether she produced a son. That pressure began at the marriage bed and could continue until menopause or widowhood. Modern fertility treatment can be emotionally devastating, even with medical knowledge and privacy. Medieval royal fertility unfolded before an audience and without reliable explanation. Each menstrual cycle carried political meaning. When pregnancy stopped because of age, a queen's role changed again. If she had surviving sons, she could become revered as the mother of dynasty. If she had only daughters, succession arrangements varied by kingdom and law. If she had no children, her political position could weaken sharply. Her body's natural aging became a constitutional fact. Succession law was not uniform across medieval Europe. Some realms allowed women to inherit crowns under certain conditions. Others developed principles excluding them. Claims could pass through women even when women did not reign directly, producing later conflicts. The 100 Years' War, for example, involved competing interpretations of dynastic legitimacy after the extinction of the direct Capetian male line in France. Edward III of England claimed the French crown through his mother Isabella, daughter of Philip IV. French political elites supported Philip VI of Valois instead. One queen's birth connected two monarchies to a war that lasted generations. Isabella's motherhood therefore outlived every scandal attached to her. Through her came a claim vast enough to reshape Western European history. This is another paradox. Medieval political culture distrusted female rule in many contexts, while depending constantly on women to transmit legitimacy. A princess could be denied the throne because she was female, then become indispensable because her son inherited through her blood. Genealogy was destiny. Courts maintained knowledge of ancestry because marriage within prohibited degrees could raise canon law problems, and because claims depended on descent. Queens learned family trees that resembled diplomatic maps. Cousins were potential spouses, allies, rivals, or claimants. Consanguinity was widespread among elites because the pool of suitable royal partners was limited. The Church's rules on prohibited degrees changed over time, and papal dispensations could permit marriages otherwise barred. That made marriage both sacred institution and legal puzzle. A couple could spend years together, only to have opponents suddenly rediscover a genealogical impediment when annulment became politically useful. The Queen could watch lawyers debate whether her marriage had ever been valid. What does that do to identity? If marriage made her queen, and lawyers declared the marriage invalid, what became of the years she had spent giving birth, travelling, hosting, praying, and representing the dynasty? Canon law could transform biography into argument. Bertha, Ingeborg, Eleanor, Isabella, and many other medieval royal women encountered marital politics shaped by annulment, separation, repudiation attempts, or contested legitimacy in various kingdoms. Ingeborg of Denmark's marriage to Philip II of France in 1193 became especially grim. Soon after the wedding, Philip sought to repudiate her. Ingeborg resisted, insisting the marriage was valid. She spent years marginalized and confined, while papal pressure and political conflict continued. Eventually, she was restored to recognized position. Her story reads less like romance than legal endurance stretched across decades. Imagine the daily reality behind that dispute. You are called queen by some and rejected by your husband. Clerics argue over documents. Your income depends on political decisions. Your movements are restricted. Your future hinges on men in distant courts discussing whether your marriage counts. Years pass while the case remains unresolved. There may be no more medieval form of misery than waiting for a pope, a king, and a council of clerics to decide whether your own life is legitimate. Religion could protect queens as well as constrain them. Canon law's insistence on valid marriage created barriers against easy repudiation. Papal interventions sometimes supported abandoned wives. Convents offered royal widows or separated women spaces of relative autonomy. Sacred status gave queens moral language with which to challenge husbands. But church politics was politics. Popes needed alliances. Bishops served dynasties. Excommunications and interdicts could be instruments in negotiations. A queen's marital case could become entangled with wars, imperial elections, and territorial disputes. Confessors occupied this complicated frontier. They heard sins and advised conscience, but royal confessors could become political figures because they had extraordinary access. A queen might tell a confessor fears she could tell no courtier. He might urge patience, repentance, charity, or resistance depending on circumstances. The sacramental seal of confession was sacred, yet everyone around the court knew spiritual influence could shape political choices. Piety could also give a queen a language for refusal. She could object to an act as sinful. She could invoke vows. She could appeal to saints, bishops, or the Pope. In societies where religion structured legitimacy, spiritual arguments mattered. Still, conscience was another burden. Medieval queens were taught that their rank increased responsibility before God. Wealth could endanger the soul. Anger, pride, envy, lust, greed, and neglect of the poor carried spiritual consequences. A queen was judged publicly by subjects and invisibly by God. There was no place beyond evaluation. The fear of damnation was not theatrical. Death could come suddenly. A fall from a horse, infection, childbirth, or fever might end life before confession. People made wills, arranged masses, donated to monasteries, and carried devotional objects because eternity felt near. Queens planned their burials in detail. They chose churches, tomb styles, religious beneficiaries, and distributions of property. Some requested humble elements despite magnificent status. Others emphasized dynastic grandeur. Burial was final self-presentation. Yet even a carefully planned tomb could be destroyed by later wars, reformations, revolutions, rebuilding, theft, or neglect. Gold was stripped, effigies damaged, monasteries dissolved, graves moved. The queen, who had spent a lifetime preserving reputation, could not control what later centuries did with her body. Memory proved even less controllable. Chroniclers simplified, enemies exaggerated, legends attached themselves to famous names. Eleanor of Aquitaine became a heroine, seductress, rebel, and feminist icon, depending on the age retelling her. Isabella of France became a she-wolf. Margaret of Anjou became a theatrical monster. Philippa of Hainault became the merciful intercessor. Real people hardened into roles. Modern tourism continues the process. Visitors enter castles and ask where the queen slept. Gift shops sell crowns. Films fill halls with polished stone and perfect gowns. The smell disappears. The servants disappear. The pregnancy losses disappear. The hours of prayer disappear. The accounts, debts, diarrhea, toothaches, damp bedding, political anxiety, and repeated journeys disappear. What remains is spectacle. To recover daily life, we have to put weight back into the objects. The gown is not just beautiful, it is heavy after 4 hours. The crown is not just gold, it presses into the head. The castle is not just romantic, it is cold at dawn. The feast is not just abundance, it is etiquette performed while strangers watch. The marriage is not just alliance, it is a teenage girl crossing the sea. The nursery is not just succession, it is a mother listening for a child's breathing. The chapel is not just architecture, it is where fear goes when medicine cannot help. And the bed is never merely a bed, it is where the queen sleeps under guard, where marriage is consummated, where pregnancies begin, where children are born, where fever is watched, where ambassadors wait outside for news, where a dying ruler receives sacraments, where servants remove stained linen before a chronicler can turn bodily reality into a clean sentence. The medieval queen's day began in that bed and often ended there under the same scrutiny. Dawn did not restore freedom, It restarted the performance. The servants entered, water arrived, linen changed, hair was combed, clothing was layered, jewellery selected, prayers recited, a chaplain waited, a clerk brought letters, a lady repeated gossip, an official requested a signature or seal, a messenger had come from the border, the king wanted to speak with her, her son had a fever, a city delegation waited below, a poor widow had petitioned for mercy, the cook needed to know whether fasting rules applied, her physician wanted to examine her urine, her mother's letter was 3 weeks late. Then the doors opened. She walked into public life. Perhaps the morning brought mass. The Queen entered the chapel beneath the eyes of nobles. Candles burned before painted saints. Gold leaf caught the light. The Latin words were familiar, even if her first language was different. She knelt. Her knees hurt against the cushion. She prayed for the king, the children, the dead, the kingdom, and perhaps herself. After Mass came business, petitioners, household officers, accounts, an ambassador. The Queen listened and answered carefully. She knew a sentence spoken too quickly might travel to another court. At dinner she sat beneath a canopy, hands washed ceremonially, dishes arrived in sequence, musicians played. She tasted food she might not want. She noticed which lord appeared angry, which bishop avoided another's gaze, which lady had received a new jewel from someone she should not. Afterward she withdrew, but withdrawal did not mean solitude. Ladies followed, a clerk brought correspondence, an embroiderer showed a design for a church hanging, a nurse reported that the child's fever had eased. For the first time that day, relief reached her face. Then someone announced a messenger from the king. Plans changed. Perhaps she rode out. Perhaps she received guests. Perhaps she lay down because pregnancy had exhausted her. Perhaps she went to a garden and walked beside a fountain. Perhaps she spent an hour reading a psalter while rain tapped the shutters. These were the spaces where life could become genuinely pleasant, but pleasure remained contingent. A bell rang, a servant entered, a horse arrived at the gate. Evening brought another meal, entertainment, prayer, or counsel. Candles shortened, shadows grew. The Queen's household gradually reduced itself around the chamber. Jewels were removed and locked away. Clothing came off layer by layer. Her hair was combed loose. If she was lucky, the king was affectionate. If she was unlucky, he was angry. If he was away, she wondered where he slept and whom he trusted. If he was at war, she wondered whether he was alive. She climbed into bed. The curtains closed. The attendants did not go far. That was an ordinary day, and ordinariness is what made it exhausting. Catastrophes such as rebellion, plague, miscarriage or invasion were dramatic, but most suffering came in accumulation. A little cold every morning, a little less privacy every year, another pregnancy, another farewell, another ceremonial smile, another petition, another night waiting for news. Misery rarely arrives wearing black armour. Often it arrives dressed as duty. The Queen's privileges made that duty survivable. She had food, shelter, attendance, medicine, horses, books, gardens, music, jewels, and influence beyond the imagination of most medieval women. She could protect monasteries, help relatives, commission art, reward loyalty, and sometimes shape the fate of kingdoms. Some queens clearly enjoyed power and used it with skill, but privilege also magnified expectation. Because she had more, she was expected to be more fertile, more graceful, more devout, more generous, more politically useful, more self-controlled. The crown did not excuse human weakness. It criminalized it when weakness threatened succession. A peasant woman could have a bad marriage and suffer terribly in obscurity. A queen's bad marriage could produce civil war. A merchant's wife could lose a child and grieve within family. A queen could lose a child while diplomats recalculated alliances. An ordinary woman could become infertile and face social pain. A queen's infertility could threaten a dynasty. An aristocratic widow could argue over inheritance. A queen dowager could become the centre of a succession crisis. Scale transformed private life into history. That is why chronicles often make queens look less human than they were. The sources notice them most when the kingdom notices them. Marriage, coronation, pregnancy, intercession, scandal, war, death. Long, ordinary months disappear. Yet those missing months formed the majority of life. They contained sore feet, unfinished letters, jokes among ladies, dogs asleep near fires, children learning to read, forgotten prayers, mended sleeves, stale bread, spring flowers, tooth pain, rain delays, musicians practicing badly, servants arguing, favourite dishes, insomnia, and homesickness. The best way to understand a medieval queen is therefore not to picture her on a throne. Picture her between thrones. Picture her at 5 in the morning while servants relight the fire. Picture her on the road with wet hems and a numb hand around the reins. Picture her in childbirth while a kingdom waits for a cry. Picture her sitting through a banquet after hearing that her brother has been defeated in battle. Picture her in a chapel, trying to bargain silently with God for the life of a sick child. Picture her counting weeks since a messenger left home. Picture her receiving a golden cup from a city whose people are struggling to buy grain. Picture her smiling because everyone is watching. There were moments when queens broke the script. They rebelled, negotiated, refused, invaded, governed, patronised and manoeuvred. Their agency mattered. Medieval women were not passive decorations waiting for history to happen. Eleanor of Aquitaine helped shape succession politics across 2 kingdoms. Blanche of Castile governed France with determination. Isabella of France participated in the overthrow of a king. Margaret of Anjou fought to preserve her husband's dynasty. Philippa of Hainault used intercession and patronage to build a powerful queenly image. Countless less famous queens managed estates, brokered marriages, mediated disputes, and preserved dynastic networks. But agency is not the same as freedom. A prisoner can make choices inside a cell. A queen made choices inside a structure built from marriage, lineage, religion, gender, and rank. Sometimes she learned to use that structure brilliantly. Maternal authority gave access to sons. Piety created moral legitimacy. Charity built popularity. Marriage connected courts. Widowhood opened financial autonomy. Household patronage created loyal networks. Queenship offered tools. Every tool had an edge. Maternal authority depended on surviving children. Piety could become accusation of clerical influence. Charity required money. Marriage created divided loyalties. Widowhood began with death. Household networks produced factional enemies. This is why the most successful queens were often masters of ambiguity. They influenced without always appearing to command. They spoke through intercession. They turned family affection into diplomacy. They made patronage look like generosity. They converted ceremonial roles into political access. The image of the helpless queen misses this intelligence. The image of the all-powerful queen misses the danger. Both existed at once. The contradiction became clearest when the queen physically approached the king. In formal settings, she might sit below or beside him, according to ceremony. In private, she could speak when ministers were absent. That access was her greatest political resource. No parliament could regulate every conversation between husband and wife. Enemies understood this and feared it. They blamed queens for decisions they disliked, because private influence could not be measured. A tax, appointment, pardon, or alliance might be attributed to the Queen's Council, whether or not she had caused it. This gave queens power and made them scapegoats. Foreign queens were particularly vulnerable. If policy favoured their homeland, critics saw betrayal. If policy opposed it, their birth families saw disloyalty. A successful queen navigated between identities. that modern nationalism encourages us to separate, but medieval dynastic culture intertwined. She was simultaneously daughter of one house, wife of another, mother of a third generation, patron of religious communities, lady of estates, employer of servants, client of bankers, correspondent of popes, and public symbol of the realm. No wonder the household never stopped. A royal wardrobe could employ specialists simply to maintain appearance. A chapel had clergy and musicians. A kitchen had layers of hierarchy. Stables required dozens of workers. The Queen's administrative staff processed money and documents. Her almonry distributed charity. Her chamber protected intimacy. All these departments converged on a single human schedule. If she overslept, people waited. If she became ill, people lost access. If she died, hundreds of livelihoods changed immediately. Servants grieved, but they also needed new positions. Officials surrendered seals. Household goods were inventoried. Debts were assessed. The dead queen's dresses could be distributed, reused, sold, or stored. Her horses passed to others. Rooms were reassigned. Death dismantled the performance quickly. The funeral then rebuilt it one last time. The Queen's body was washed and prepared according to period custom. Embalming could be used for royal corpses, especially when transport or prolonged ceremonies required preservation. Clothing and insignia transformed the dead woman into an image of office. In some royal funerals, an effigy represented the deceased when the body itself could no longer be displayed. Processions moved through streets. Candles burned. Clergy chanted. Black cloth turned familiar architecture into mourning. Bells announced loss to people who had never spoken to the Queen. At the burial church, dynasty gathered around stone. The woman who had spent life moving from palace to palace finally received a permanent location. Even then, permanence was illusion. Tombs were opened, abbeys were dissolved, wars damaged churches, metal was stolen. New rulers shifted attention elsewhere. Names faded. What survives today often survives by accident. A charter with her seal, a book with her ownership mark, an account mentioning a payment, a ruined tomb, a piece of jewellery attributed uncertainly, a letter folded centuries ago, a chronicler's hostile sentence, a town tradition that may or may not be true. Historians reconstruct a life from fragments because daily experience rarely leaves a full archive. We know that a queen ordered cloth. We infer the feel of it. We know that she travelled in January. We imagine the cold, but must not pretend to know the exact weather. We know she lost children. We recognise grief without inventing words she never wrote. The discipline matters because medieval queens have often been buried twice, first in tombs, then beneath fantasy. One fantasy is romantic: the castle, the gown, the crown, the banquet, the handsome king. Another is grotesque: the claim that everyone was permanently filthy, ignorant, diseased, and brutal. Reality was more interesting. Medieval courts were sophisticated and uncomfortable, cultured and violent, devout and ambitious, materially luxurious and medically vulnerable. Queens inhabited all those contradictions in their own bodies. They could read elegant poetry about perfect love while living in a negotiated marriage. They could commission an illuminated virgin and child after burying an infant. They could fund hospitals while physicians failed to treat their own infections. They could sponsor peace while armies fought for their children's claims. They could own perfumes from distant trade routes and still smell smoke in every room. They could sleep beneath silk and wake to fleas. They could wear gold and fear childbirth. They could command and obey. That final contradiction is the key. Medieval queenship was not a simple prison, because queens possessed real authority. It was not simple power, because authority was conditional. It was a role in which a woman could stand closer to the centre of government than almost anyone else, while remaining vulnerable to decisions about marriage, reproduction, property, and movement that were not entirely hers. The crown made her visible. Visibility made her useful. Usefulness made her controlled. Think again of the morning chamber. The fire has almost died. Dawn is beginning behind the shutters. The Queen has not yet moved. For a few seconds, no one speaks. Outside the bed curtains, a lady waits with the day's gown. A chaplain has already prepared the chapel. A clerk holds letters sealed during the night. In the kitchen, cooks are working. In the stable, grooms tighten girths. At the gate, a messenger from the north has arrived, covered in mud. In the nursery, a child is coughing. The Queen opens her eyes. There is no alarm clock, but the kingdom is already awake around her. She rises because hundreds of people depend on the fact that she will rise. Water touches her face. Linen is changed. Hair is drawn into order. The day's jewels are chosen according to who will see her. A woman fastens one sleeve, then another. Someone reports that the king slept poorly. Someone else says the ambassador insists on an audience. The physician asks whether the Queen has bled this month. The question is medical, dynastic, and humiliating at once. She answers quietly. Then she hears Mass. Perhaps she prays for a son. Perhaps she prays not to be pregnant again. The two prayers could belong to the same woman at different moments, or even the same moment. That possibility rarely appears in dynastic records. Official documents wanted heirs. The body carrying those heirs might have wanted survival. After Mass she receives news. A castle needs repair, a cousin seeks money, a bishop requests support, a prisoner's wife begs mercy. The Queen decides whom to help. Each decision creates gratitude and resentment. At midday she eats. A servant carves meat, another pours wine. She listens while men discuss war as if war were a map. She thinks of the daughter whose marriage will secure one of the alliances under discussion. In the afternoon she walks outside if weather allows. The garden smells of herbs. For a few minutes there is sunlight on the wall. A lady tells a joke. The Queen laughs hard enough to forget herself. Then bells announce visitors. By evening she has changed clothing twice. Her back hurts. The ambassador has stayed too long. A letter from home finally arrived, but the news is bad. Her mother is ill. She cannot leave. The distance is too great. The roads are unsafe. The king needs her at court. She dictates a reply, knowing it may arrive after the funeral. At night she kneels again. This is the kind of misery that wealth cannot purchase away. Distance, duty, uncertainty, and the knowledge that time is moving faster than messages. Her bed curtains close. Tomorrow may bring a hunt, a feast, or childbirth. It may bring nothing dramatic at all. That is what makes the life recognizable across 800 years. Human beings are not exhausted only by catastrophe. They are exhausted by repetition, by being needed, by never quite being alone. A medieval queen was needed constantly. Her husband needed alliance, her dynasty needed children, her children needed protection, her servants needed wages, her petitioners needed mercy, her church needed patronage, her birth family needed influence, her new kingdom needed loyalty, her chroniclers needed a moral lesson, history needed an image. Very few people asked what she needed. When we walk through surviving medieval palaces today, the rooms are quieter than they ever were. The fires are controlled. The latrines are archaeological curiosities. The tapestries sit behind conservation barriers. Labels identify queens by marriage and dates: daughter of, wife of, mother of. A visitor can cross in 10 minutes a space where a woman spent years negotiating access, pregnancy, illness, and fear. The silence is misleading. Put the sound back. Hear the kitchen knives, horses in the yard, bells from the chapel, clerks reading letters, a baby crying, musicians tuning, servants carrying wood, rain hitting shutters, a priest murmuring beside a sickbed, a cart grinding over stones, women whispering behind a curtain. Put the smell back. Smoke, beeswax, wool, leather, roast meat, fish, wet dogs, herbs, perfume, sweat, damp walls, horse manure, incense, and fresh bread. Put the temperature back. Cold corridors in January, overheated birthing rooms, dusty roads in July, a church that chills the knees, a bed warmed with heated pans or bottles only to cool before dawn. Put the weight back, wool and silk, fur and jewels, pregnancy, expectations, memory. Then the crown changes shape. It is still beautiful. Medieval royal art was designed to make beauty persuasive. Gold reflected sacred light. Gems suggested permanence. Ceremony transformed unstable political arrangements into something that looked eternal. But the human head beneath the crown was never eternal. It sweated. It ached. It aged. It worried. It remembered home. The Queen's life was not tragic every hour. She may have loved her husband. She may have adored hunting. She may have delighted in books, children, music, gardens, or political debate. She may have possessed a fierce appetite for influence and enjoyed the contest. Historical women deserve that complexity. Yet even the happiest queen lived without protections modern audiences take for granted. No antibiotics if childbirth caused infection. No reliable contraception if another pregnancy could kill her. No rapid transport if her child was sick in another country. No private telephone. No legal concept of marital autonomy comparable to modern standards. No way to separate public office from family body. The dynasty entered the bloodstream. That is why the glamorous phrase, "life of a queen," can deceive. The most expensive object in the palace was not always the crown. It was the queen's capacity to endure. Courts invested in her appearance because appearance stabilised power. They invested in her fertility because children stabilised succession. They invested in her household because households created patronage. They invested in her piety because piety legitimised rule. Everything around her announced honour. Much of it also ensured performance. A ceremonial canopy looked like privilege. It marked where she must sit. A household looked like service. It guaranteed she was observed. A marriage looked like elevation. It removed the possibility of an ordinary private choice. A nursery looked like joy. It measured political success through surviving children. A castle looked like protection. It could become confinement overnight. The same object changed meaning depending on who controlled it. Perhaps that is the most modern lesson hidden inside medieval queenship. Power is not simply the ability to command. Freedom is not simply the possession of wealth. A person can occupy a privileged position and still live inside expectations so total that refusing them would destroy identity, family, and security. Medieval queens understood this before they had words for it. They learned to bend rather than break. Some turned ceremony into influence. Some turned motherhood into political authority. Some turned widowhood into independence. Some used patronage to create artistic and religious legacies that survived their dynasties. Some failed, some were crushed. Some became legends that barely resemble the women they were. Their remains, when identifiable, are often startlingly ordinary. Bone does not preserve etiquette. A skeleton does not show the hours spent choosing words before an ambassador. Teeth may show diet or disease. Pelvic bones may hint at biological history, but cannot narrate every birth. Isotopes may reveal movement across landscapes. DNA may identify kinship. Science can return pieces of the body, but not the private thought behind the ceremonial smile. For that, we return to documents and imagination disciplined by evidence. A wardrobe account tells us cloth was purchased. A letter tells us she worried about money. A chronicle tells us she intervened. A tomb tells us how someone wanted her remembered. A marriage treaty tells us what kingdoms wanted from her before she arrived. A list of children tells us how often her body was placed at risk. A travel itinerary tells us how rarely she stayed still. Together they produce not a fairy tale, but a schedule. And the schedule is exhausting. Wake early. Pray. Dress. Receive. Eat publicly. Listen. Smile. Intercede. Travel. Write. Conceive. Carry. Give birth. Recover. Mourn. Repeat. Between those verbs, govern. Between those duties, try to remain a person. The Queen's private self survives only in flashes. A gift to a favourite servant, a book chosen for personal devotion, a letter asking about a child, a sudden act of mercy, a place she returned to repeatedly, a saint she favoured, an object mentioned in a will. Those fragments matter because they resist the crown. They remind us that royal identity never consumed the human being completely. When Eleanor of Aquitaine spent years confined, the title Queen did not explain what she thought each morning. When Philippa of Hainault buried children, consort did not describe the grief. When Isabella of France crossed to England with an invasion force, she-wolf did not explain the marriage that preceded it. When Margaret of Anjou fought for her son, ambitious did not capture a mother watching a dynasty collapse. Labels simplify because history is large. Daily life restores complication. Daily life asks what time she woke, who touched her hair, how cold the room was, whether she had privacy to cry, how long a letter took to arrive, who removed the blood after childbirth, who told her the child had died, who stood outside while she prayed, who profited when she smiled. These questions do not make medieval queens less political. They reveal what politics cost. The cost was paid in hours, pregnancies, journeys, silences, and bodies. And it was paid by others too. Every queen's life depended on women carrying water, washing cloth, nursing babies, stitching garments, preparing medicines, and managing waste. Their names are often missing. They knew the queen at her least symbolic. They saw her without the crown. A laundress knew the stains, a midwife knew the danger, a chamberwoman knew whether the queen slept, a nurse knew whether the baby was thriving, a lady knew which letter made her cry, a confessor knew what she feared for her soul, a cook knew which food she could stomach during pregnancy, a groom knew how carefully she mounted after illness. The official image of queenship was therefore produced by people who witnessed its fragility every day. Most kept silent because service required discretion. Some gossip escaped, some evidence entered accounts, much vanished. Behind the ceremonial screen, the queen depended on trust. Trust was dangerous because courts rewarded information. This returns us to surveillance. Modern privacy is protected partly by physical separation. Bedrooms with locks, bathrooms used alone, private messages sent instantly. A medieval queen's environment blurred those boundaries. Servants entered the chamber, clerks handled letters, messengers carried correspondence physically. Religious advisors asked intimate questions. Physicians examined bodily fluids. Ladies accompanied visits. Guards controlled movement. She had spaces called private that modern people would experience as communal. A privy chamber was private relative to the Great Hall, not private relative to modern solitude. A queen might therefore develop privacy psychologically rather than architecturally. A coded letter, a trusted friend, a silent prayer, a garden walk where the conversation stayed deliberately trivial, a book whose margins no one else understood. Secrets were expensive, and some secrets could not be kept. Pregnancy showed, illness showed, aging showed, political favour showed through seating and gifts. Grief showed despite efforts to control it. The queen was trained to turn visible emotion into acceptable emotion. She could mourn piously. She could plead mercifully. She could celebrate modestly. Rage was harder. Sexual desire was dangerous. Open political ambition was risky. Men were allowed a wider range of royal performance, warrior, judge, hunter, lover, penitent, conqueror. Queens were often praised through narrower archetypes: virgin bride, fertile mother, merciful intercessor, pious widow. Women who escaped those categories made chroniclers nervous. Some escaped anyway. Eleanor negotiated, Blanche governed, Isabella rebelled, Margaret fought. Their reputations became contested precisely because they exposed how much queens could do when circumstance demanded it. Yet none escaped biology or mortality. That fact equalized the palace in the end. Childbirth did not care about heraldry. Infection did not care about genealogy. A tooth abscess did not recognize anointing oil. Plague did not bow. Royal medicine could surround the body with experts, but experts still worked within limited knowledge. Learned physicians might calculate astrological timing, inspect urine in glass flasks, discuss humours, recommend bloodletting or dietary adjustments. Midwives brought practical experience. Herbalists and apothecaries offered remedies accumulated through tradition. Clergy added prayer. The Queen received the best her society knew and remained dangerously exposed. That exposure influenced religious feeling. Modern audiences sometimes interpret intense medieval piety as superstition because they inhabit a world where medicine solves problems prayer once accompanied. But imagine facing labour with no surgical team capable of managing catastrophic hemorrhage. Imagine a child's fever with no antibiotics. The appeal of saints and relics becomes emotionally comprehensible. Faith was not merely lack of knowledge, it was a framework for living with uncontrollable risk. The Queen's Chapel transformed risk into ritual. Candles could be lit, masses could be commissioned, pilgrimages could be promised, alms could be distributed. These actions gave form to helplessness. When the child survived, gratitude had form too. A gift to a shrine, a new foundation, a precious vessel, public thanksgiving. When the child died, mourning also had form. Black cloth, masses, tombs, annual anniversaries. Ritual made repetition bearable. Perhaps that is why the medieval court loved ceremony so deeply. Ceremony did not only display power, it organized uncertainty. Coronations told people who ruled. Weddings told them which alliance mattered. Baptisms told them the dynasty continued. Funerals told them how death entered order. Processions turned unstable politics into visible sequence. The Queen was central to this work of making chaos look ordered. Her smile at a wedding suggested peace. Her pregnant body suggested future. Her intercession suggested mercy. Her mourning clothes suggested continuity after loss. Her crown suggested permanence. None of those things were guaranteed. Peace failed. Children died. Mercy was selective. Dynasties ended. Crowns changed heads. The performance continued because people needed to believe otherwise. That is the burden hidden beneath medieval magnificence. A queen did not simply enjoy the illusion, she helped manufacture it. She knew the kitchen was short of money while guests praised abundance. She knew the king was ill while ambassadors praised strength. She knew the heir had a fever while crowds celebrated succession. She knew the marriage was cold while poets sang of harmony. She knew the castle could fall while banners made it look eternal. To live at court was to live inside the gap between appearance and condition. Some queens mastered the gap. Others were destroyed by it. The daily discipline required to maintain appearances is difficult to measure, but modern psychology gives us language for constant self-monitoring. Medieval sources do not. They show its traces indirectly. Ceremonial rules, household ordinances, moral advice, complaints about improper dress or speech, reports of emotional outbursts treated as extraordinary. The exception reveals the rule. If a queen shouting publicly became memorable, it was because she was usually expected not to. If a queen rode at the head of troops became scandalous, it was because she was usually expected to embody power differently. If she refused reconciliation with her husband, chroniclers explained it because obedience was assumed. Every deviation became narrative. Ordinary endurance vanished. So when we say the daily life of a medieval queen could be pure misery, The phrase should not mean a cartoon of constant suffering. It means something sharper. The very privileges that made her life enviable also created a system in which nearly every human need could acquire political consequences. Need sleep? The court calendar disagrees. Need privacy? Your reputation requires witnesses. Need time to grieve? The ambassador has arrived. Need to stop having children? The dynasty needs an heir and a spare. Need to go home? Your marriage treaty says home is now another kingdom. Need to leave your husband? Canon law, diplomacy, property and war stand in the doorway. Need to be angry? Chroniclers are listening. Need to be weak? Enemies are watching. This is misery not as dungeon but as obligation, and obligation could last from adolescence to death. A girl of 12 might learn that negotiations had begun. At 15 she could travel abroad. At 16 she might marry. At 17 she might be pregnant. Before 20 she could have lost a child. By 30 she might have endured 6 or 8 pregnancies. By 40 she could be a political mother arranging marriages for grown children. By 50 she might be widowed, regent, exiled, or buried. These ages are illustrative, not universal, but the compression was real. Royal women could experience adult responsibilities astonishingly young by modern standards. Their bodies aged through work that paintings conceal. Portraiture and manuscript art emphasize symbolic beauty. The Queen is smooth-faced, upright, richly dressed. We rarely see varicose veins after pregnancies, scars from illness, missing teeth, swollen joints, or exhaustion under the eyes. Art served status, not medical realism. Modern film often repeats the idealization even when costumes are dirty enough to appear authentic. A beautifully lit actress stands in a stone chamber and looks lonely. Reality was more crowded, more procedural, and more repetitive. The Queen did not spend every evening staring dramatically out a window. She spent time listening to people explain problems. That may be the most realistic royal activity of all. A tenant dispute, a household debt, a servant seeking marriage permission, a monastery requesting timber, a relative requesting a loan, a diplomat asking a favour, a noblewoman complaining about her husband, a chaplain proposing a foundation, a merchant demanding payment. Power attracts problems. The Queen became a human intersection through which problems moved. She had to remember them because records were imperfect and personal promises mattered. Forgetting a request could offend someone for years. Remembering a minor kindness could create loyalty across generations. Her memory, therefore, became political infrastructure. So did her body language. Looking bored at a petition insulted the petitioner. Showing too much enthusiasm for one ambassador alarmed another. Sitting close to a lady elevated her. Wearing a gift publicly acknowledged the giver. The court read signs because direct statements were often impossible. The Queen learned to speak in signs too. She might place someone near her at dinner. She might send a piece of cloth. She might ask after a child. She might attend a particular shrine. She might delay a response. These small acts created meaning far beyond themselves. The result was a life in which spontaneity became dangerous. Modern people idealize spontaneity as authenticity. Medieval monarchy idealized predictability, because predictability signaled order. The Queen's personal impulses had to be filtered through rank. She could not simply run through a market unnoticed. She could not choose an anonymous lover. She could not disappear for a weekend. She could not post an angry message and delete it later. Words once released travelled by memory and parchment. Reputation repaired slowly. That was especially true for sexual reputation. A rumour whispered in one court could follow a queen across Europe because dynastic networks were tightly connected. Chroniclers copied older claims. Political enemies revived accusations decades later. A woman could spend a lifetime being judged for something that never happened. The stakes explain the presence of attendants in intimate life. Witnesses protected legitimacy. When an heir was born, High-ranking people might be present nearby to reduce suspicion of substitution. Later early modern royal births could become even more public in certain monarchies, but medieval dynastic childbirth already carried pressure for credible witness. Imagine labour while knowing the room is not simply there to help you. It is there to verify you. The newborn is washed and wrapped. People examine sex and health. The information leaves the chamber before the mother has recovered her breath. A messenger rides. The kingdom celebrates. The mother bleeds. Few images capture the imbalance more clearly. Yet queens also used childbirth politically. A successful birth strengthened their standing. A queen mother could secure gifts, lands, and influence. She might advocate for her natal relatives or household more effectively. Maternal identity became a source of authority no male courtier could duplicate. This is why fertility was both burden and weapon. The same duality shaped widowhood. The husband's death brought grief and danger, but it could also remove daily male control. A wealthy dowager with adult sons might manage her own household, choose residences, sponsor religious houses, and intervene in politics with greater independence than she had possessed as wife. Some women discovered their freest years after losing the person who had made them queen. That freedom came at the price of bereavement. Nothing in queenship arrived cleanly. If the king loved her, she gained influence but risked being blamed for favoritism. If he ignored her, she lost influence but escaped some scrutiny. If she bore sons, she gained security but entered factional succession politics. If she bore daughters, she created alliances but might be blamed for lacking a male heir. If she was beautiful, she gained prestige but attracted sexualized rumor. If she was plain by contemporary standards, enemies mocked her and husbands might reject her. If she was foreign, she brought alliance but attracted xenophobia. If she assimilated completely, her birth family could accuse her of forgetting them. The ideal queen was required to satisfy incompatible audiences. That remains recognizable. Public women today are still told to be strong but not domineering, attractive but not vain, ambitious but likable, devoted to family but fully productive. The medieval version was harsher because law, theology, dynastic survival, and physical danger intensified the contradiction. The distance between then and now is enormous, but the emotional mechanism has echoes. This is where the past connects most powerfully to the present, not because modern women live like medieval queens, but because the queen's story reveals how societies can disguise pressure as privilege. People looked at the crown and saw fortune. They did not see the schedule. People looked at the palace and saw safety. They did not see the locked gate. People looked at the children and saw dynasty. They did not see the miscarriages. People looked at the feast and saw abundance. They did not see the nausea. People looked at the marriage and saw peace. They did not hear the arguments behind curtains. Medieval queens lived inside those blind spots. Their descendants, figuratively speaking, live in the way we still confuse status with happiness. A beautiful life can be exhausting. A prestigious role can be lonely. A person surrounded by attendants can lack companionship. A woman with influence can lack control over her own body. The Middle Ages make those contradictions visible because everything was written into ceremony. The Queen's body literally represented the future of the state. When she walked into a cathedral, people saw legitimacy. When her belly grew, people saw succession. When she wore mourning, people saw continuity. When she smiled beside the king, people saw unity. The real emotions behind those symbols remain mostly unknown. That uncertainty deserves respect. We should not put modern confessions into medieval mouths. We cannot know that every arranged bride was miserable, every pregnancy unwanted, every political queen secretly traumatized. Sources sometimes reveal affection, confidence, humor, ambition, and genuine religious conviction. But we can identify conditions. We know travel was slow and physically demanding. We know childbirth was dangerous. We know infant mortality was high. We know royal marriages served dynastic aims. We know women's sexual reputation carried severe political consequences. We know courts offered limited privacy. We know royal households were dense networks of service and surveillance. We know queens could be confined, repudiated, exiled, or blamed for political failure. We know medicine could not control many causes of death. From those conditions, the pressure becomes visible without inventing private thoughts. And once visible, the fairy tale collapses. The castle is still beautiful, the gown still shimmers, the feast still astonishes, but the queen walking through it is no longer a decorative figure. She is working. She has been working since before sunrise. She worked when she dressed because appearance was politics. She worked when she prayed because piety was legitimacy. She worked when she ate because dining was ceremony. She worked when she gave birth because reproduction was succession. She worked when she mourned because grief was public ritual. She worked when she slept because even the bedchamber belonged to dynasty. There was no clocking out. The closest thing to retirement was widowhood, convent life, political eclipse, or death. For some queens, a religious house offered peace in later life. Monasteries and convents could provide educated female communities, spiritual focus, and distance from court. Royal widows sometimes founded or favoured houses where they expected burial. But even retreat could remain political. A royal widow carried networks and property with her. Silence was never entirely silent around a queen. Her name continued to attract petitioners. Her children continued to ask advice. Her estates continued to produce disputes. Her past continued to shape claims. Only death ended the administrative day, and even death generated paperwork. Wills named beneficiaries, executors handled debts, servants claimed wages, religious houses received bequests, jewels were assigned, funeral expenses were calculated, tombs were commissioned. The dead queen became an estate, then a memory, then, sometimes, a myth. Today we can stand before the remains of those myths and ask a different question. Not, what was it like to be rich? Not, what did queens wear? But, what did this role demand from a human body every single day? The answer changes the image. We see a young bride trying to understand a foreign court. We see a pregnant woman climbing narrow stairs. We see a mother receiving news from a nursery. We see a diplomat choosing every word. We see a widow reading account rolls late into the day. We see an aging woman warming swollen hands near a fire while servants discuss another journey. We see a person whose title magnified everything that happened to her. The medieval queen did not live above ordinary human vulnerability. She lived where vulnerability became political. A fever became rumour. A miscarriage became succession anxiety. A quarrel became faction. A friendship became patronage. A journey became diplomacy. A burial became propaganda. The extraordinary weight of queenship came from that conversion. Nothing stayed small, not even a mourning. At sunrise the palace stirs again. A servant opens the shutters. The sky is grey. Somewhere in the courtyard a horse stamps against stone. Smoke rises from kitchens. Bells call the household toward prayer. The queen sits while her hair is arranged. She has not slept well. No chronicle will record that. A lady fastens a jewel at her throat. No treaty will mention how heavy it feels. A clerk tells her that riders arrive from the border before dawn. That may enter history. The queen looks at herself in a polished mirror of metal or glass, depending on place and period. The reflection is dimmer than a modern mirror. She sees enough. Then she stands. The doors open. People bow. For the rest of the day, whatever she feels belongs partly to them. This is why the crown can be understood not only as a symbol of power, but as an instrument of compression. It compresses wife, mother, diplomat, patron, landholder, believer, foreigner, widow, and woman into one public object called queen. History often remembers the object. Daily life belonged to the person trapped inside it. And if we recover that person, the romance does not disappear. It becomes more powerful because it is no longer false. The candle-lit hall is beautiful because we know how cold the corridor was. The jewelled manuscript is precious because we know it may have been one of her few private refuges. The garden is peaceful because we know the chamber was crowded. The surviving letter is moving because we know how far it travelled. The royal child matters because we know how many did not survive. The tomb matters because we know how difficult survival had been. This is the Middle Ages, without the fairy tale and without the caricature. A world of astonishing art and ordinary pain. A world where queens could change history and still need help getting dressed. A world where a woman might command a county, yet be unable to choose whether to cross a border. A world where luxury insulated people from poverty, but not from grief, infection, childbirth, politics, or time. That is the daily life behind the crown. Not endless torture, not endless splendour. Something more unsettling. A life so privileged that everyone assumed it must be fortunate, and so controlled that fortune often felt like duty. Tomorrow morning, servants will enter again. The fire will be low, the letters will be waiting, the kingdom will need something, and the queen will rise.